From the end of the First World War to the start of the Second, little attention is really given to the rise of the Nazi Party within Germany, nor is much attention given to the acquisitions that the nation made prior to the outbreak of the war. But in the mid to the late 30s, a number of events occurred that cemented Germany towards a war footing, and had there been an Allied response, would have changed the entire dynamic of the Second World War. In this video, we'll be looking at the Anschluss. Unification of the German people into one state had been a goal since the fall of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, and two nations, the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia, vied to be the nation to unify the Germanic lands. A number of wars between the two led to Prussia coming out on top in 1866, and after a war with France in 1870, managed to get all the Germanic states outside of Austria to agree to unification. While the German public in Austria stayed loyal to the state, they were more loyal to the Habsburg monarchy and still had ideals, even passive, of one day being united. Following the end of the First World War and the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, popular opinion in Austria largely favored some sort of union with Germany, but it was explicitly forbidden by the peace treaties of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Even still, a German Austria Republic was declared, one that claimed all majority German lands to be part of its state. Of course, the Western powers didn't recognize this republic, and the First Austrian Republic only held around half of the land that it claimed, even in German majority regions, with the largest section going to Czechoslovakia in what would be the Sudetenland, one of the sparking points of the war 20 years later. The constitutions of the Weimar Republic and the First Austrian Republic included a goal of unification, which was widely supported by democratic parties in both countries. In the early 1930s, popular support in Austria for a union with Germany remained overwhelming, and the Austrian government looked to a possible customs union with Germany in 1931, but the French protested, even though the nation was a source of heavy German investment throughout the 20s. An anti-Anschluss party rose to power in the nation during the late 20s, and paramilitary forces between both the ruling party, the Christian Social, and the Socialist parties eventually started to fight one another, as the Christian party enforced more stringent guidelines on the overall public. The Austrian Nazi Party attempted various coups over the years, and when defeated outright, fled to Germany and still instigated attacks against political figures, souring the public's desire for an Anschluss to some degree and removing a large block of their support in the nation. On March the 4th of 1933, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss suspended the Austrian parliament, following the leaders of the parliament leaving office to vote on an important piece of legislation. Dollfuss used this opportunity to declare that Parliament had ceased to function and blocked all attempts to reconvene it, also threatened to use military force against the representatives should they try to reconvene. Fighting erupted between socialist forces and the Austrian government, which resulted in a civil war. Dollfuss was victorious after 2 weeks of fighting and outlawed all parties save for his own, and started Austria towards a fascist state, but more like Italy's rather than Germany's. Italy had a vested interest in keeping Austria under their sphere of influence, and threatened a war against Germany if they attempted to intervene in the Civil War, and instead, Germany issued a boycott and embargo against the state, crippling it economically. After 3 years of this boycott, the new Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg reached an agreement with Germany, where the imprisoned Nazis were released, and the party was then unrecognized within the state, as well as to follow Germany's lead in foreign policy. While this did anger the Italians, the Western Allies had driven a wedge in their previous relationship. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, much to the protest of France and Britain, each threatening sanctions against Italy if they refused to stop the invasion. Italy ignored them, and continued on with the invasion, leaving the Stresa Front the following year, the defensive pact between the three to contain Germany. At the same time, Mussolini tried to improve relations with Germany, seeing them as a potential ally in place of the Western powers. Germany was going through a 4-year plan, with the goal of expanding its war-making capabilities to be able to fight against the whole of Europe in 4 years. They were building up arms factories, gathering up raw materials, as well as creating synthetic oil. It soon became clear that they couldn't keep up with the time frame, and interest in an Austrian annexation grew more and more. Austria had large iron mines, a large workforce, and many more raw materials that would be important to keep the plan in progress. The different factions within the governmental leadership also largely agreed about Austrian annexation, with Hermann Göring being the loudest voice. While he didn't agree with Hitler regarding the situation in Eastern Europe, both largely agreed that Austria needed to be under their control, even if that meant breaking with the Italians. To accomplish this, Germany sent a list of ultimatums to the Austrian government, having them gradually cede more and more power to the Nazi Party in the state, all the while trying to use riots caused by the party members to justify an invasion. Following failed bids for referendums of unification, Chancellor Suchanek stepped down on March the 11th of 1938, leaving a Nazi supporter in his place. The following day, German troops crossed the border into Austria, greeted by cheering citizens all along the way. Even though the invasion was poorly coordinated, the Austrian army had been ordered to stand down and not protest the invasion force, and a placebo was offered to see if the public truly wished unification. Hitler's forces suppressed all opposition, and before the first German soldier crossed the border, Heinrich Himmler and a few SS officers had landed in Vienna to arrest representatives of the First Republic. During the few weeks between the Anschluss and the plebiscite, authorities rounded up Social Democrats, Communists, and members of various other parties, as well as Austrian Jews, and imprisoned them or sent them to concentration camps. Within a few days, 70,000 people had been arrested. The plebiscite was subject to large-scale propaganda and to the removal of the voting rights of nearly 10% of the voting population, with it mainly being members of left-wing parties and Jewish individuals. A rigged placebo was held, and with over 99.7% in favor, and thus the Austrian Republic was annexed into the right, with Mexico giving the loudest protest out of any nation at the time. Today, I hope you enjoy. The US and the UK are seen and have been seen as close allies, sharing a common language, culture, and the century-old slights long forgotten, but this wasn't always the case. Up until World War I, neither nation had a real favorability to one another, and saw each other as regional competition, with many incidents that nearly caused war over the years. Today we will be looking at one such example, the Arastook War. The conflict between the two arose from a border dispute between the state of Maine and the Canadian province of New Brunswick. The issue stemmed from the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ended the American Revolutionary War. The treaty did not clearly determine the boundary between British North America and the United States, so the Commonwealth of Massachusetts began issuing land grants in present-day Maine, which it owned at the time. The War of 1812 saw the British occupy most of eastern Maine, as they intended to annex the areas of occupation to some degree. The Treaty of Ghent that followed reaffirmed the boundary line as of the 1783 treaty, and while a commission determined who owned the islands in Passamaquoddy Bay, it didn't define the land boundary, which again was in question between the two. When Maine was separated into its own state in 1820, the boundary question was a massive concern for the new state, and it was also still a concern for Massachusetts, who owned upwards of half of all the public land in Maine, including large sections of the disputed territory. The British saw the extension of territory so hindering between inland and coastal regions that it made communication and travel much more difficult. If they had control over the northern half of the claimed land, it would cut travel time between Quebec and Halifax in nearly half. The region was also a major source of lumber, which was vital to both Maine's and New Brunswick's economy. Losing the region would pretty much cripple the economy of either province. This proved to be a greater incentive to the British, when thousands of acres of New Brunswick were destroyed in the Great Mariachi Fire in 1825. Tensions only grew with the proclamation of the Republic of Madawaska within the disputed territory in 1827, and the Republic of Indian Streams 5 years later. The 1830 census in Maine had a number of families within the disputed region, who wanted to have their land subject to the state and the incorporation of various small towns by committee. The New Brunswick's militant leader was alerted of this, and he threatened to arrest anyone that was part of the committee, which didn't come of anything. The Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812 had allowed a third party to arbitrate any further disputes, and Wilhelm I, King of the Netherlands, offered that arbitration. A series of arrests and mild skirmishes eventually led to Maine's governor claiming that the British were invading. He raised $800,000 to raise the militia and to establish fortifications, with the federal government passing a bill to allow the president to spend $10 million to raise the army if fighting erupted. The Maine militia occupied points all along the Arastook territory, raising upwards of 11,000 men, with a representative from Maine stating to the federal Congress that regardless of the outcome from Washington, Maine would defend what it viewed as its territory. Congress in turn authorized 10,050,000 men to defend in the event that the situation deteriorated further, and construction of Forts Kent and Fort Fairfax were laid down. Units of the regular British Army, plus upwards of 20,000 militia units, garrisoned the whole Arastook Valley and along the St. John River. Neither nation wanted a war that would have greatly interfered with the two nations' trade, and a compromise was finally reached in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. This treaty settled land disputes along the Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, and New Hampshire border with British North America. The British retained the northern area of the disputed territory in Maine, which included the Halifax Road, which was the key to year-round overland communication between Quebec and Nova Scotia. The U.S. government agreed to pay the states of Maine and Massachusetts $150,000 each for the loss of the lands and for the expense in keeping the Maine militia raised for 2 years.
Following the fall of France in 1940, little seemed to be able to stop the German nation. The Allies had been beaten in Norway, the neutral Channel nations taken over in days, and France, the big continental power, had all but collapsed within 6 weeks. Great Britain alone now stood against this powerful enemy and feared a full-scale invasion of the island nation, something not felt since Napoleonic times. A German invasion of Great Britain is one of the most well-known and difficult to pull off alternate history scenarios, one that I will eventually get around to covering. However, an invasion of Maine British soil did take place, yet it's a lesser-known factoid in history, but no more. In today's video, we will be looking at the German occupation of the Channel Islands. From the start of the war on September the 9th of 1939 to May the 9th of 1940, little changed on the Channel Islands. Conscription did not exist, the horticultural and tourist trades continued as normal, with many tourists and servicemen on leave being able to travel to the islands for some much needed rest and relaxation. However, this changed when on May the 10th, the Germans invaded France and the Low Countries. Air bases on the islands were used to conduct attacks on German forces, and later Italian towns when Italy joined the war in early June. With the Allied defeat in France in mid-June, the Channel Islands were not deemed strategic enough to be defended by the British government, and so preparations for troop evacuation was ordered for June the 20th. Even still, boats from the islands were used to evacuate troops from the French mainland, but they were to not stay for long. The Channel Islands had been demilitarized and declared an open town by June the 15th. However, the statement was not made public as the British government did not want to invite the Germans to take the islands. The Channel governments were left in pretty much utter chaos, as they weren't able to get much in the way of straight answers from the mainland government, and each were essentially left to do whatever actions they decided to take. The authorities in Albany, having no direct communication with the UK, recommended that all islanders evacuate, and all but a handful did. In Cirque, it was encouraged that everyone was to stay, while in Guernsey, they evacuated 80% of children that were of school age, giving the parents the option of keeping their children with them or evacuating them with their school. Due to the influx of people that aimed to leave, the official message turned to one of staying the following days, and in total, 5,000 school children and 12,000 adults out of 42,000 were evacuated from the island. In Guernsey, only about 6,000 out of 55,000 were evacuated. The Germans did not realize that the islands had been demilitarized, as it wouldn't be made public until June the 30th, so they approached them with caution. Reconnaissance flights proved to not garner much information. However, there were some carts that were loaded with tomatoes that were mistaken as troop carriers in St. Peter's Port, the main town of Guernsey's, and the surrounding area got bombed, which resulted in the total of 44 civilian deaths. The Wehrmacht drew up plans to invade the islands with 2 assault battalions. However, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot, Captain Lieben Pideritz, made a landing on an abandoned airfield in Guernsey and scouted around the area. With this information, he made the statement that the islands were undefended, so a platoon of Luftwaffe airmen were flown in that evening to Guernsey's airfield by Junker transport planes. Guernsey surrendered on July the 1st. Albany, where only a handful of islanders remained, was occupied on the 2nd. A small detachment traveled to Sark, which was surrendered on the 4th. Thus, the oldest held lands of the British nation were lost without a single shot. The Germans quickly consolidated their positions as they brought in infantry, they established communications and anti-aircraft defenses. Establishing an air service was occupied mainland France, and they rounded up the British servicemen that were on leave in the islands. Life under the occupation didn't change too terribly much, at least at the immediate start. The island's government, which remained in place, had very little guidance as to how to proceed forward, however. Other Axis-occupied governments had either been fully replaced or served as direct proxies, but not here. UK law hadn't been updated in over a century in regards to operating under occupation, with the most recent law dating back to the British Treason Act of 1800. Guernsey itself had their most recent treason law that was passed back in 1495. The German occupiers were normally pretty polite to the island citizenry, and they didn't interfere with the government on a large scale, at least for some time. From the start, the islands won the right to keep their civilian governments, courts, and laws, with the only concession being that Germans would have to approve all new laws passed. Many of the remaining islanders ended up working for the Germans in some capacity, just to be able to continue to survive. Before the war, the island government was the largest employer of civilians, with local businesses being a close second. However, staff and jobs in general for both were slashed heavily, so many found themselves out of work, and for the ones that still worked for the government, they saw their pay cut in nearly half. The Germans had a need for many skilled workers, and they would offer double what someone could get for the same job under a different employer. For labor jobs, all young men on the island had to register and be assessed by the Fieldkommentaar, the military administration of the area. By 1943, around 5,000 men from the islands acted as laborers for the Germans. Compared to other occupied populations, these men were paid for their work to some degree and given better quality food, at least for the first few years. The German army invested heavily in the islands as part of their Atlantic Wall defense strategy, a line of fortifications that stretched from Norway to the border of Spain. The Channel Islands were essentially turned into one giant fort, and throughout 1942, 1/12 of the resources funneled into the Atlantic Wall were dedicated to the fortification of the Channel Islands. Hitler had decreed that 10% of the steel and concrete used on the Atlantic Wall would go to them, and many say that the island chain was better defended than the Normandy beaches, and the series of tunnels and bunkers that were established very much turned them into an impenetrable fortress. However, by 1942, effects of the occupation started to be felt by the islanders. Food, fuel, and medication became much more scarce, and criminal activity by the civilians became much more common, more so after the Germans confiscated all radios from the islanders. Prior to 42, the only real show of resistance was passive, and it was largely through Churchill's V for Victory campaign, with many German signs being marked with a white V. Radios were confiscated due to this, but many either managed to hide them or they created their own. The most visible sign of resistance occurred in Guernsey following the sinking of HMS Sheridabis and HMS Limburn on October the 23rd of 1943. The bodies of 21 Royal Navy and Royal Marines washed up on shore, and the funeral attracted over 20% of the population, who laid over 900 degrees on their coffins. This was enough of a demonstration against the occupation for military funerals to be closed to civilians by the German occupiers. During June of 1944, the Allied forces launched the D-Day landings and the liberation of Normandy. They decided to bypass the Channel Islands due to their heavy fortifications, and as a result, German supply lines for food and other supplies through France were completely severed, hurting the already pretty meager food situation on the islands. The chain had imported around 80% of its food pre-war, and while a large section of the island population had left, the 30,000 German soldiers and German laborers ended up eating more food than the general civilian population. Access to fertilizer was one of the main reasons that the crop production slowed down, as not only did regular fertilizer become more scarce, but the seaweed substitutes was largely cut off, as the beaches were now heavily fortified. The failure of the potato crop in 1944 meant that a large number of the population now faced starvation, especially when Normandy was occupied by the Allied forces. For many months, the ration calorie intake per person was only around 700 per day. They were only saved in early 1945 when the SS Vega, loaded with supplies through the Red Cross, arrived on the island, but life was still extremely difficult until liberation. Following the German surrender in May of 1945, the islands were gradually turned back over to the British, with them fully under control by May the 17th, putting another chapter of history finally to rest.
This is one of the most iconic photos of the Second World War. But what most people don't know is that this is faked. Modified, edited, whatever you want to call it. And today, we're going to be looking into how they did it and the reasons why they did it. Raising a flag over the Reichstag was taken on May the 2nd of 1945 during the Battle of Berlin. The men in the photo, while originally heavily disputed, are that of 18-year-old Alexei Koyev, who is attaching the flag, 35-year-old Abdul Hakim Izimov, who is steadying Koyev, and 29-year-old Leonid Gorishev. Gorishev, hell a third person in general, was originally never reported. Indeed, official Soviet reports did not credit any of the men listed above. Instead, they would name Junior Sergeant Milutin Katarina and Sergeant Mikhail Yogorev as the men that hoisted the Soviet banner over the Reichstag. When the wider shot was released months after, a third man, Lieutenant Commissar Alexei Berest, would be shoehorned into the reports. It was only years later that the original photographer Yergeniv Haldy would come forward with the names of Koyev and Izimov. Gorishev would go unaccredited all the way until a television documentary in 1995, when Koyev would recount the names of the men that were with him during that iconic photo. So, with the naming controversy out of the way, why was this photo edited afterward? And simple, PR and propaganda purposes. See, if you compare the two photos side by side, the differences are pretty hard to spot, but there are indeed two of them. One of them, the more obvious one, is that smoke was added into the background, copied over from another photo. Haldy added the smoke from another image in an effort to make the photo as a whole more dramatic. However, the second change was much more subtle. See, the photo was going to be published in the May 13th edition of the Ogonyok, Russia's longest-running weekly magazine, which unfortunately closed its doors permanently in December of 2020 due to persistent financial troubles. The editor of the magazine at the time noted that Izimov had two watches on, one on either wrist. This would imply looting, which was punishable by execution. To avoid this, Haldy would go over the photo and, using a needle, would blot out the second watch, covering it up in hopes of avoiding any mention of it. Of course, the question still got asked, and the original response was actually an Adrianov compass, essentially just a wrist-held compass that was common in the Red Army, and it wouldn't be until the late 70s that the truth about the watch would be made official, because obviously that's what people were focusing on in the 70s. But regardless, this would end the tale of how one of the most iconic photos of World War II, the Soviet version of the Iwo Jima photo, was faked.
The colonization of the Americas was one of the most major events that the world has ever seen. It was one of, if not, the main force that changed the dynamic of power back in the old world, bringing the concept of colonial conquest and settlement back as a focus for many nations to undertake. While the colonial adventures of nations such as Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Portugal are rather well known, many other nations throughout the centuries attempted their own colonial ventures to varying degrees of success. In this video, we'll be looking into some of these nations. The first nation that we will look at is Austria. The Austrian Empire had not attempted to establish colonies during its existence, being focused on regional control in the Holy Roman Empire, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. Austria also lacked the naval capabilities to project power outside of the Adriatic. Nevertheless, Austria and later Austria-Hungary tried to establish overseas colonies throughout the 18th and 19th century. The Kaiserliche Ostindische Company was founded in the Austrian Netherlands in 1722. The company set up 2 colonies in India, which was one in present-day Kowloon and another in Ichapur. While the company held a few ships in the region, it transported nearly 7 million pounds of tea from China into Europe between the years of 1723 and 1728, amounting to nearly half of all tea imported. The company was abandoned in the Second Treaty of Vienna in 1731. In 1775, a new Austrian East India Company was founded by the name of the Antwerp Company in Ostend and Trieste. 2 years later, a small fort was created on Montagu Bay, which had been abandoned earlier by the Dutch. The fort was later occupied by the Portuguese, as the Austrians lacked the naval arm to protect the fort. Later, they also claimed the Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean as an imperial colony. The Austrian government didn't give this colony much in the way of support, however, and the colonists left on the island chain eventually ended up dying from the lack of food and water. This, combined with pressure from other European powers, led to Maria Theresa dissolving the Trieste East India Company in 1783 and eventually abandoning all claims. During the 19th century, the Navy made a few expeditions with the intent of looking for potential colonies, such as ones in Borneo, Guadalcanal, and China. But in both Borneo and Guadalcanal, the Austrian expeditions were being backed by heavy indigenous resistance, and no further attempts were made. As a result of the Boxer Revolution in China and Austria-Hungarian participation in the Eight-Nation Alliance, the Austrians got a small concession in Tianjin. Unlike other colonial powers, the Austro-Hungarians gave the population citizenship. When the Chinese entered the war against the empire in 1917, the concession was quickly taken, and the peace treaty in 1919 forced them to renounce all claims. The next nation we'll be looking at is the Duchy of Courland. Courland had a population of only 200,000, and it was a vassal of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Under Duke Jacob Kettler, the duchy established one of the largest merchant marines in the whole of Europe, and the cities of Ventspils and Liepāja acted as its main harbors. The first attempt at a colony was tried in Tobago in 1637. This colonial attempt was defeated by the Spanish in the region. They attempted again 2 years later, which the Spanish blockaded and eventually starved out the colonists. 3 years after that, 2 ships with about 300 settlers attempted to settle on the north coast near Courland Bay. This colony was again blockaded, but proved more successful. Missionaries among the native Carib tribes armed the natives to attack the settlement, which was eventually abandoned. Under agreement with other Protestant powers, Courland's attention shifted to Africa. In 1651, the duchy gained its first successful colony in Africa on Kunta Kinte Island in the Gambian River. They also established another colony in present-day Banjul, the modern Gambian capital. The colonies were lost when neighboring nations took advantage of Courland during the Northern Wars. Tobago was returned to Courland after the war, but the duchy abandoned it in 1666, with an attempt to retake it 2 years later, ending in failure. 3 decades after that, the island was sold to the British to pay off some of the debt that the Duke had acquired. Denmark, along with her sister kingdom of Norway, had established colonies during the Viking Age in both Iceland and Greenland. Events in the homeland during the Kalmar Union and after largely distracted the Danish from attempting to establish overseas colonies, as well as an overall lack of population. King Christian IV had originally granted authorization to establish a Danish East Indies Company, but the involvement in the 30 Years' War heavily drained interest in the idea. They started colonies on the uninhabited islands of St. Thomas and St. John in the mid and late 17th century, attempting to tap into the wealth of the very profitable triangle trade. They later purchased St. Croix from France in 1733. The Virgin Islands in the Caribbean were divided into two, one British and the other Danish. The islands were run by the Danish East India and Guinea Company until 1755, when King Frederick V bought the two companies. Sugarcane drove the island's economy, which was largely driven by slave labor. Although the slave trade was abolished in 1803, slavery itself on the islands were not abolished until 1848, in response to massive slave revolts and protest. The colony reached its largest population in the 1850s, after which an economic downturn increased emigration and the population dropped, just as sugar prices as a whole. This decline continued until after the island's purchase by the United States in 1917. From the beginning of the French colonization efforts, members of the Knights of Malta had been predominant members in the established colonies. During the 1600s, the order was mostly made up of French aristocrats, and many French naval officers had trained with the Hospitaller Navy. They had a pretty deep connection within the French colonial government during this time as well. Philippe Poincy was the main individual that drove the Knights' colonization efforts. King Louis XIII appointed Poincy as a lieutenant governor over the whole Caribbean colonies, and he started to establish French rule over a number of islands. He started the establishment of the first European settlement on Saint-Barthélemy in 1648, and founded a settlement on St. Croix 2 years later. He sent men to reinforce and take over a small French settlement on Saint Martin, establishing the border between French and Dutch sections on the islands, which is still in place today. The French company in the Caribbean was dissolved in 1651, in which the Order of Malta ended up buying the islands of Saint Barthélemy, Saint Christopher, Saint Croix, and Saint Martin. These islands were still technically under French control, but the Knights were in control of the local islands government. In the 1660s, the order gave up the claims to the islands, citing lack of economic value and difficulty in controlling them, so the owner, after some internal fighting, was reverted back to French control. The last nation we'll be looking at is Sweden. Sweden during this time had reached its territorial height in Europe and sought to establish colonies in the New World. The Swedish South Company was formed in 1626, with the goal of establishing a colony somewhere between Florida and Newfoundland. This company set up a colony on both sides of the Delaware River in 1633, land in present-day Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, with the building of two forts in the area, Fort Christina and Fort Trinity. The colony was prosperous throughout the 1640s, but lacked much in the way of support from the mainland in terms of military defense. In 1655, at the start of the Second Northern War, the Swedish colony was captured by the Dutch in the region, but were given local autonomy for another decade. A colonial effort in the Gold Coast was also established in 1650. A few forts and trade ports were set up in the colony, but it lacked to turn over to much of a profit. When the Danish took control of the fort in 1658, this was used as a pretext to continue fighting in the Second Northern War. While the colony was placed back under the control of the Swedes, the Danes managed to take it over 3 years later. In regards to the Caribbean, Gustav III of Sweden, attracted by the island's prosperity during the American Revolution, agreed to exchange French trading rights in Gothenburg for Swedish colonization of the island. In addition to its freshwater resources, the island produced moderate amount of sugar, cocoa, tobacco, and fruits, while it promised revenue from trade through its natural harbor on the island's west coast. While the colony was profitable during the early 19th century, it gradually lost its importance as a free port, losing even more value when slavery was outlawed on the island and the population started to decline heavily. The island was sold back to the French in 1877, putting the final end to Swedish colonial interests.
The early 1930s is normally viewed through the lens of two events: the Great Depression and the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. The latter, which carried a series of events that led Germany to start the Second World War. However, another nation had a similar series of events, a goal of expanding its territory in the face of powerful neighbors by any means necessary. For Germany, this was the Anschluss of Austria and the occupation of Czechoslovakia. For Japan, that was the Asian continent. In this video, we'll be looking at the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So normally I have a bunch of background information that gets all of you somewhat caught up on events. However, the history surrounding this conflict and after is extremely long and somewhat complicated. So what you'll get is a much more abbreviated, hitting super major points list, as many of the events that I'll be talking about each warrant a 20 or 30 minute video on their own. Japanese territorial ambitions in China had been a national directive dating back many centuries, but it wasn't until the late 19th century that Japan managed to finally get a major foothold on the continent. The 1895 Sino-Japanese War was a humiliating defeat for Queen China, as the no longer isolated and now modernized Japanese forces defeated the much longer Qing armies, and managed to acquire a number of territories off of them. These territorial concessions included the island of Taiwan, and it shifted Korea into the Japanese sphere of influence. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War broke out, which resulted in Japan making even more territorial gains and humiliating the Russians in the process. Korea was vassalized in 1905 and annexed as an imperial territory in 1910, accomplishing a centuries-long goal of the Japanese nation. Following World War I, islands in the Pacific that the Germans held were granted to the nation as well. However, disagreements during the actual treaty process and many of the armed and naval treaties years after put a strain on relations between the West and Japan. Japan had also attempted to assert heavy influence in the Russian Far East during the nation's civil war / revolution. They sent over 70,000 troops into the area surrounding Vladivostok, over 5 times what the Western Allies had put forth in the region. This attempt was to get a puppet government headed by white Russian forces to serve Japanese interests and allow the island nation to use the resource-rich area for their own gain. However, the white Russian movement fell apart in the early 20s, and political differences back at home, as well as pressure from the Western powers, prevented Japan from annexing the territory for itself. This alone destroyed the unity that the government had during World War I, and the military government and civilian government would be locked in bitter competition for years after. By 1930, the civilian government had largely lost its control over the military, who now acted with heavy degrees of autonomy. This loss of control had been ongoing ever since the 1880s, with the creation of the Army and Naval Commanding Staffs. These staffs were equal in power to the Minister of War, and answered directly to the Emperor rather than having to go through the civilian government. The Army and Navy also had decisive say on the formation of any civilian government, since the law required that the posts of Army Minister and Navy Minister be filled by active duty officers, and since the law also required that a Prime Minister resign if he could not fill all of his cabinet posts, both the Army and Navy had final say on the formation of a cabinet and could bring down the cabinet at any time by withdrawing their minister and refusing to nominate a successor. While this only happened once, the threat always loomed high when the military made any demands on the civilian leadership. Even with the military in essential control of the government in Japan, the Kuomintang Army in Korea largely ignored or acted in direct defiance of the headquarters in Japan. Many of its senior leaders advocated political change in Japan through the overthrow of the democratically elected civilian government, denouncing it as a liberal evil, and wanted to heavily strengthen the power of the Japanese emperor in its place. They also advocated a more aggressive, expansionist foreign policy regarding the Asian mainland, eyeing the whole of China as ripe for the taking. During the same time, China had just sort of unified after the Deadly Warlords period, yet many factions continued to either fight against or work directly against the nationalist government. Japan had influenced northern warlords in Manchuria since the early 20s, but when the faction fell apart, they were left with little in the way of powerful supporters in the provinces, and they decided to correct this wrong. The chance came in mid-1931, following two incidents. The first being the Wanpo-shan incident, which was a very minor affair between Chinese and Korean farmers in the small village of Wanpo-shan. The Koreans were building a dam and irrigation system from land that they leased from a local broker. This trench included several miles of land that they did not lease and were owned by local Chinese. A group of Chinese farmers drove the Koreans out, and the police came in and dispersed the Chinese with no casualties. While this may seem like a very small incident, public reaction was not. Anti-Chinese riots erupted in many Korean cities, and many anti-Korean riots happened in China. However, China alleged that over 700 casualties occurred from this incident, with many local farms being burnt to the ground. This led to mass murder of ethnic Koreans throughout China, with a death toll reaching in the tens of thousands. This act nearly caused war between the two, but calmer heads sort of prevailed, and war was averted for the time. Yet the Japanese army in Korea was looking for another opportunity to invade China. They'd get this chance with the Mukden incident on September the 18th of 1931. Colonel Shishiro Itaki and Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Iswara of the Kuomintang Army devised a plan to force a Japanese invasion on Manchuria. A rail line existed not far from the Chinese garrison under Shan Shulian, and while the location had no formal name and no real military significance, they figured that by destroying a section of this line, they'd be able to garner enough support for a full-out invasion using the incident as pretext. They placed explosives near the tracks, but far enough away to do no real damage. Late on September the 18th, the explosions were detonated. The next morning, two Japanese artillery batteries from their companies opened fire on the Chinese garrison. The small Air Force garrison was destroyed, and 500 Japanese soldiers attacked the nearly 7,000 garrisoning troops. The Chinese troops were no match for the experienced Japanese soldiers, and by the evening, the fighting was over, and the Japanese had occupied Mukden at the cost of 500 Chinese lives and only 2 lives for Japan. Julian ordered his troops to not fire upon the Japanese following this, and to store away their arms. The Japanese proceeded to occupy the major cities of Changchun and Ankan and their surrounding areas with minimal difficulty. The military governor in the region, Ma Zenshan, began to resist the Japanese by November. This was followed by Generals Ting Xiao and Li Du with their provisional forces. Between September the 20th and September the 25th, Japanese forces took a number of major cities in the Liaoning province, essentially giving them full control over the area. Tokyo was shocked by the news of the army acting without orders from the central government, with the civilian government being thrown into disarray by the insubordination. But as reports of one quick victory after another began to arrive, it felt powerless to oppose the army, and instead sent 3 more divisions from Japan to aid in the effort. Using the repair of the bridge at Nen River as pretext, the Japanese sent a repair party under protection to the Chinese-held location. Fighting erupted between the Japanese forces and troops loyal to the acting governor of Haolongxin, General Ma Shanshan. Ma Shanshan would become a hero in China for his defense at the bridge, even though his troops suffered heavy casualties. His defense would be a main drive for many individuals to join an anti-Japanese militia in the region. This militia would go on to fight against the Japanese occupation for nearly 14 years, and prevented the whole of Manchuria from being pacified. The Chinese government in Nanjing largely collapsed following the invasion, and when it reformed in late December of 1931, they ordered all Chinese forces to retreat behind the Great Wall, effectively giving the whole of southern Manchuria over to the Japanese. The last major Chinese forces in northern Manchuria were led by General Tin Shao, who organized the defense of Harbin. Shao managed to hold out for 17 hours with poorly equipped and largely untrained civilian militia. He would surrender on February the 24th, officially ending major regular army hostilities in Manchuria. Within days, Henry Pugh, former emperor of China that was deposed in 1911, was made emperor of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, and Ma Shanshan was bribed to switch allegiances and managed to keep his post as governor. The peace wouldn't last long, however. By April of 1932, just 2 months following the formation of Manchukuo, Shanshan would revolt against the Japanese, along with Tin Shao and General Li Haxin. Together, these men had over 300,000 under their command, and they would stage major guerrilla strikes and ambushes against Japanese and Manchu forces. What took the Japanese just 3 months to occupy would cost them over a decade to pacify. And with that, another chapter in forgotten history comes to an end. I hope you enjoyed. World War II started what would be the mass independence of European colonies all around the world. While some were released peacefully, many attempts at independence were met with bloodshed and war. The last of these bloody colonization conflicts, was the Portuguese wars in present-day Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. Yet, at the same time, Portugal also fought against another nation for their colonial holdings, a war that would see the end of over 400 years of Portuguese rule in the region, and finally removed the last vestiges of European colonial ties. In today's video, we'll be looking at the Indian invasion of Goa. Portuguese influence in India can be dated all the way back to 1500. Pedro Alvares Cabral sailed to India and established a free trade port known as a factory at the time in present-day Calicut. Fighting erupted shortly after between the Portuguese and the local Indian state, with Cabral and his men killing over 600 individuals, and they established a solid control over the immediate area. From 1505 onward, the Portuguese gradually expanded holdings all across India, to include over 24 ports and towns at its height in the subcontinent. After heavy fighting in December of 1510, Goa would come under Portuguese control, and the city would serve as the Portuguese colonial capital for all territory in the Indian Ocean. As the capital of Portugal's Eastern Empire, Goa was granted the same privileges as Lisbon. Its Senate maintained direct communication with the king, and they paid a special representative to express its interest at the royal court. In 1563, the governor even proposed to make Goa the seat of a parliament, in which all parts of the Portuguese East were to be represented. The 16th century served as what many call the Goan Golden Era, as vast trade fleets would center themselves out of Goa, and the wealth that the colony had was extremely vast. However, the Golden Era wouldn't last for long. The Dutch blockade of the territory in 1603 and 1635, as well as major disease epidemics, destroyed the perceived protection that the colony had. The trade was gradually monopolized by Jesuits in the colony, and fighting against both the Mughal and Parthian empires saw a majority of held land being lost. The capital was shifted from the old city of Gao in 1843 after the vast majority of its citizens had left, and it was relocated to Banjim, which then acted as the colonial capital. After World War I, the instability in the Portuguese government led to some leaders in the colonies to try and vie for changes within the state. Unrest against Portuguese rule within the territory would be pioneered by Tristo de Branca Cunha, who founded the Gowan Congress Committee in 1928, and he also worked with various Indian independence movements at the time. The Congress largely called for nonviolent protests and demonstrations, and worked to expand similar movements within the remaining French territory in India as well. In reaction to the growing dissent, the Portuguese government in Gao implemented policies which curtailed civil liberties, including censorship of the press. Strict censorship policies required any material containing printed words, including invitation cards, to be submitted to a censorship committee for screening. By the 1940s, the Gowan independence movement had gained momentum, inspired by the Indian independence movement, which had entered its critical phase. When the British announced that India was to be independent in 1946, Indian leaders focused their attention on movements in the Portuguese India and French India to get those colonies to join the newly independent Indian state. Massive protests and demonstrations occurred within Gao during 1946, with the leaders and over 2,000 people arrested. With the vast amount of the leadership arrested, a lot of the momentum for independence faded away. In July of 1954, pro-Indian forces managed to invade and occupy the Portuguese exclaves of Dadra and Nadir Haveli, headed by the United Front of Gowans. Due to the landlocked nature of this territory, Portugal was unable to defend the land, and following this, the Portuguese aimed to keep control of the remainder of their territory in the subcontinent, but action wouldn't occur for another 7 years. On November the 24th of 1961, a passenger boat passing between the Portuguese-held island of Anjadiva and the Indian port of Coche was fired upon by Portuguese ground troops, resulting in the death of a passenger and injuries to the chief engineer. The action was perpetrated by Portuguese fears that the boat carried a military landing party intent on storming the island. The incidents lent themselves to fostering widespread public support in India for military action in Gao. On December the 18th of 1961, Indian forces invaded the remaining territories of Gao, Daman, and Dui. Facing them was a combined army of around 5,000 Portuguese, with the majority of them being stationed in Gao. A quarter of these men were barely trained, and even more were security and police forces raised to aid in the defense. To assist them, the Portuguese had one naval ship of the line, the sloop NRP Alfonso de Albuquerque, which boasted 4 120mm guns and 4 machine guns. They also had 3 light patrol boats, each with a 20mm gun, with one of them stationed in each territory. The message from mainland Portugal was to hold out for as long as possible, 8 days being ordered, and the commander on the ground, Governor General Manuel Antonio Vassalli e Silva, was told that his men were either to be victorious or dead. Silva of course disagreed and didn't follow this order, as he would be facing upwards of 45,000 Indian troops. Fighting began on the morning of the 18th, and by the end of the day, the vast majority of Portuguese territory was occupied, with the bulk of the Portuguese forces now holed up within the military base at Albuquerque, situated at the entrance of the port town of Vasco da Gama. In Gao itself, General Silva's orders from the mainland were that he was to have committed a scorched earth policy, burning the whole of Gao to the ground and to wait for naval reinforcements. However, Silva saw the situation on the ground and knew that it would simply be a useless sacrifice, and by the following day, he and over 4,500 men surrendered. Upon the surrender of the Portuguese Governor General, Gao, Daman, and Dui were declared a federal administered union territory. A Major General K.P. Condith was appointed as its military governor. The war had lasted 2 days, and it caused 22 Indian and 30 Portuguese lives. When they received news of the fall of Gao, the Portuguese government formally severed all diplomatic ties with India, and they refused to recognize the incorporation of the seized territory into the Indian Republic. Salazar himself decried the failure of the United Nations in his address to the National Assembly on January the 3rd. His government even offered a reward of $10,000 for the capture of Brigadier Sagat Singh, the commander of the parachute regiment who were the first troops to enter Panjim, the Goan capital. Also, his government worked to establish resistance movements within Gao. A plan was even drawn up to paralyze port operations by planting explosives within some of the ships within the harbor and detonating them, but it never went into effect. Only one such terror attack occurred from these movements, when in 1964, Casimiro Monteiro, a Portuguese national police officer, carried out a series of bombing raids within Gao itself. Relations between India and Portugal thawed only in 1974, when, following an anti-colonial military coup d'etat and the fall of the authoritarian rule in Lisbon, Gao was finally recognized as part of India, and steps were taken to re-establish diplomatic relations with India. On December the 31st of 1974, a treaty was signed between India and Portugal, with the Portuguese recognizing full sovereignty of India over Gao, Daman, Dui, Dadra, and Niger Haveli, thus putting another page of history finally to rest.
Today we're going to be looking at a bit of a special place, the most polluted island in the world, and here's the kicker: this island doesn't have a permanent human population, and is also considered one of the most remote islands on Earth. So today, we'll be delving into the history of Henderson Island. Henderson Island was first settled by the Polynesians in the 9th century, though by the time of the European arrival in the 17th century, the island had been fully abandoned. While the reason isn't fully known as to the reason for the abandonment, it is expected that the 11th century civil war on Maganeva prevented regular supplies to the outlying Polynesian colonies, and they left due to the need for survival. The first European to spot the island would be Portuguese captain Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz in 1606, who was on an expedition to find the fabled southern land of Australia. You know, standards for fabled lands really went downhill fast, didn't it? First it was Atlantis, and it was the Fountain in Youth, and now Australia. It would be another 200 years before Europeans took note of the island again, when Englishman Captain Henry Keane landed on March the 18th of 1819. Henry Keane would name the island Henderson after his ship, and he would plant the English Keane's colors. On November the 20th of 1820, a sperm whale sank the American whaling ship Essex off the coast of the island, stranding 20 men on Henderson. Due to limited supplies, 17 of the 20 men would go off in small whaling boats to South America, leaving behind Tom LaChapelle, Seth Weeks, and William Wright to survive on the island until their eventual rescue in April the following year. The tale of the Essex sinking and the survival of these 3 men would inspire novelist Herman Melville to write the novel Moby Dick. Now, after the 3 survivors left in 1821, no one would return to Henderson Island until 1902, when Captain J.F. Jones came across the island and went, "Hey, this is British now," formally annexing the islands into the British Empire. A few Americans would attempt to use the land either as a publicity stunt or try to build a mansion on the island, but ultimately, the local ecosystem has been largely untouched by human hands. Well, that is except for this. Henderson Island holds the title for the most polluted island on Earth, and it's shocking to think about, considering that it hasn't had an established human presence for hundreds of years. Yet, plastic will always find a way. The island is located right within the South Pacific gyre pattern of ocean currents on Earth, so even though Henderson was designated as a UNESCO site in 1988, it's estimated that roughly 18 tons worth of debris is on the island, with hundreds of items washing ashore every single day. The UK government did send an expedition in 2019 to clean up the island as much as they could, but weather conditions only allowed 6 tons to be removed at the time, with further expeditions being delayed due to COVID. It came into the news recently when researchers on the HMS Spray discovered that the island had been incorrectly marked for the last 85 years, being just a mile off from their original charts. But regardless, Anderson Island shows that even an area that doesn't have a permanent population is affected by our actions, and why it is important to realize that your actions, no matter how small, ultimately do have an impact.
August of 2020 will earmark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the amendment that granted women the right to vote in the United States. But with such a big cultural change, there's a lot of history that tends to go behind it that doesn't normally get talked about, and so in that video we're going to correct that wrong. In today's episode, we'll be covering the history of women's suffrage in the United States. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified on August the 18th of 1920. This amendment prevented anyone's right to vote from being infringed due to gender, and it guaranteed that women had the right to vote in the United States. Yet this amendment didn't come about without any groundwork already in place. Many states had already given women the right to vote prior to 1920, at least in some capacity, and we'll be covering that in this video. But please do keep in mind that this is an extremely extensive topic, so I'll not be able to go into detail for everything, otherwise I'd be looking at a multiple-hour video, so again, just keep that in mind while watching. While information isn't terribly concrete, women and some black individuals had the ability to vote in most, if not all, of the 13 colonies, at least prior to independence. However, there were the typical caveats. They had to be free inhabitants of the state/colony, they had to be over the age of majority, and they had to have more than 50 pounds of wealth to their name, which equates to roughly $11,000 nowadays. And there are also additional hurdles depending on the state, but the monetary requirements were the biggest hurdle, as by the laws at the time, any married woman couldn't own anything herself, as all possessions were in her husband's name. It also removed the ability for many poor individuals to vote, as the standard wage per day would only be around 1/10 of a pound, assuming I did my calculations correctly, which I normally don't. So while women technically had the right to vote, the circumstances surrounding it made it rather rare. Once the American Revolution occurred, women became a rather important part of the war effort, both in material and political ways. And while most didn't expect equality per se after the war, many did expect greater female representation from the new government. Yet that didn't happen. The exact opposite happened, actually. When the colonies declared independence and became states, they were able to write their own state constitutions, and pretty much every state wrote in laws that directly forbid women from being able to vote in that state, no matter the circumstances. New York would be the first in 1777, then Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1780, and almost all other states before the end of the Revolution. Once again, it was hoped by some that the matter of women's suffrage would be decided by the federal government, but yet again that hope was quickly dashed. During the U.S. Constitutional Convention in mid-1787, it granted each state the ability to write its own voting requirements, so all states, save one, listed that only white men had the ability to vote in their state. The one state that didn't was the state of New Jersey. Yeah, New Jersey. In its 1790 Constitution, it granted all free individuals the ability to vote regardless of gender or race, but they still needed to reach that income requirement as stated previously. But even with that hurdle, upwards of around 10,000 women voted in New Jersey for the handful of years that they were able to. Yet this would be changed by the start of the 19th century. Following Republican Thomas Jefferson's victory over Federalist John Adams in the 1800 presidential election, the Federalists came to believe that female voters benefited the Republican cause. More Republicans lived in towns, and it was easier to engage voters in urban areas than the more spread out rural areas of the states. Federalists thus thought that female disenfranchisement would limit the number of votes that Republican candidates would receive without hurting their own party. This push for disenfranchisement was pushed by bullshit arguments that women were poorly suited for political participation and that they didn't have the mental faculties to understand political matters. As New Jersey was still a Federalist stronghold, its constitution got modified in 1807, one that would limit the ability to vote to only adult white males. It would be 3 decades before any real movement on women's voting rights occurred in the United States. Kentucky would be the first to give sorta kinda statewide suffrage in 1838, but with more asterisks attached to it than being a member of the European Union. It allowed female heads of the House in rural communities to vote in elections decided on taxes and local school boards for public schooling, with women in the cities of Louisville, Lexington, and Maysville being exempt, because these cities already had public school boards in them. Elsewhere in the country, women became a very vocal part in the anti-slavery movement in the United States, with many propping up in the 1830s. By 1837, female anti-slavery societies had become numerous and strong enough that they held their first national convention in New York City, preceded by Maria Weston Chapman. These societies and conventions would continue to grow in size as call for emancipation grew across the country, and many so-called radicals at the time would find allies within these circles, who would later come back to aid them in their time of need. A number of women were present during the first national anti-slavery convention in London that happened in 1840, although they were not allowed to vote or speak, but even still, their mere presence signaled a small amount of change that would gradually expand. In 1848, New York and Pennsylvania passed laws that were pushed by citizen initiatives, known as the Married Women's Property Act. This act would give women the right to retain the property that they brought into a marriage, as well as any property that they acquired during the marriage, effectively separating the predisposition of married women being unable to own wealth. The same year, 1848, saw the first female rights convention being held in Seneca Falls, New York, which was a Quaker hotspot. The particular group of Quakers in the area had long held to the belief of equality between men and women. A group of 5 Quaker women called for a convention to take place on July the 18th. The convention itself drew an audience of nearly 400 during the 2 days of attendance. From this time, many more women's suffrage conventions would take place across the US, with them growing in numbers as they continued on an annual basis. Many women would attempt to vote in various states during the 1850s as well. However, they were pretty much all ignored and their ballots were tossed, with some even being arrested. Well-known names would appear during this time, such as Susan B. Anthony, Victoria Woodhull, and a handful of others. However, this expansion in public support would be put on hold as war began to brew in the nation. As the American Civil War raged, many suffrage supporters put aside their calls and supported the war, with the focus being towards slave emancipation for the 4 years of the conflict. While the majority of suffrage supporters went this route, a faction led largely by Susan B. Anthony continued to push the national government for greater women's rights in the middle of the war, but once again they came up largely empty. After the Civil War, the abolition and women's rights movements continued to work together, now in a combined organization. This organization was dubbed the American Equal Rights Association, in an attempt to promote universal suffrage for both blacks and women alike. They hired African American women speakers such as Louisa Matilda Jacobs to speak to audiences around New York State, and beyond that to convince them of the need for black men and all women to have the right to vote. 3 amendments passed and ratified post the Civil War would heavily disrupt the unity that the universal suffrage move had, though. A rift between the abolitionist and women's suffrage faction would grow from the 15th Amendment and its passage. Many predominant women's suffrage supporters rallied against the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendment. As while it granted black men the ability to vote, it didn't grant black women or white women that same ability. Divided over whether to support these advances for African American men at the expense of all women, the American Equal Rights Association split into 2 groups in 1869. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which was headquartered in New York by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the other group was the American Women's Suffrage Association, headquartered in Boston by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. This split marks a difference in ideology. The NWSA opposed the 15th Amendment, which was giving the black men the right to vote, unless all women were included, while the AWSA championed it. This also showed a more marked difference between two as to how they aimed to bring about change. Anthony and Stanton had aimed to change the state's constitutions individually to bring about greater change. The latter group, headed by Stone, wanted to change it directly at the federal level, establishing a political party with suffrage as its primary platform and winning support that way. Yet, while infighting occurred within the national parties, a small spark of change would occur in the far, far west, far away from the eyes of the many in the east. The Western territories in particular were a bit more open to the idea of women's suffrage at the time. The Washington Territory proposed a bill in 1854, Nebraska would in 56, and the Dakotas would in 69. And while all of these failed, the Dakota won by a single vote, it did show a big change in that side of the nation, and it shouldn't be surprising that the first territory to grant women's suffrage would be from the region, albeit it was passed for all the wrong reasons. To go further into the story, we will be looking at this man, William Bright, a saloon keeper from South Pass City in Wyoming, a frontier mining town nearly as big as Cheney at the time. In the fall of 1868, General Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and shortly after the start of his tenure, Grant would appoint a man to run the brand new Wyoming Territory. These federal picks included the governor John Campbell, Campbell's second in command Edward Lee, and Attorney General Joseph A. Carey, the top government lawyer in the state. They arrived in May of 1869, and not long afterward, Carey issued an official legal opinion that no one in Wyoming could be denied the right to vote based on race, something that had yet to be specifically recognized in the territory. William Bright would be one of the 22 legislators that got elected to the territorial legislature in September of 1869, with Campbell having a full legislature that was of an opposing party of his own. However, the political divide was still concerning to many in the legislature, as Governor Campbell aimed to enshrine that black individuals would have their rights to vote protected in the territory, which was extremely unpopular within the state chamber. To counter this, the legislature pushed a different idea. Instead of expanding black rights, they would aim to expand women's rights. They passed a law guaranteeing that teachers, most of them that were women, were paid the same whether they were a man or a woman, and they also passed a bill that guaranteed married women property rights that were separate from their husbands. As explained previously, many women's suffrage supporters were also large proponents of the abolition of slavery, and in many cases vice versa. However, after the Civil War, a significantly greater focus was being shifted into doing what was possible to make sure the freed slaves got the right to vote and were able to keep it, with women's rights being put on the back burner. This infuriated a number of suffrage supporters, and this anger was tapped by third parties to get the suffrage supporters on their side. To this end, William Bright, fairly late in the session, introduced a bill to give Wyoming women the right to vote. Unfortunately, no record was kept of what the Wyoming lawmakers actually said while they were debating the bill, but what was on Bright's mind and on the other legislators' mind can be gleaned from newspaper articles and from people's memoirs reported years later. The reason they were in support of this was that lawmakers wanted to get Wyoming some good publicity, so that more settlers would come to the territory. With the Transcontinental Railroad built and the gold mines at South Pass producing less and less gold, it seemed as though more people were leaving than coming in, and positive news stories published throughout the nation, legislators thought, might reverse the trend. The lawmakers especially hoped that the news would bring more single women into the territory, as there were 6 adult men for every adult woman, and there were very few children being born at the time. The lawmakers were also hopeful that Campbell would veto the bill, and that in turn would result in his downfall. In the State House, lawmakers tried and failed to attach various amendments. Some of these were attempts to make the bill so unattractive to the other legislators that it would fail. One such amendment which did fail would have extended the vote to all people of color, albeit in not so friendly language. The House did pass an amendment to raise the voting age for women from 18 to 21, and they also passed the women's suffrage bill 7 votes to 4 with 1 abstention. Governor Campbell took several days to decide what to do, and he finally signed the bill into law on December 10th of 1869, with a woman by the name of Esher Morris being appointed as a judge of peace in early 1870, the first woman to hold a political office in the United States. Upwards of around 1,000 women voted in the 1871 elections, and while a repeal of their ability to vote got on the governor's desk, it was vetoed, and thus Wyoming kept the ability for women to vote, but they would not be the only territory for long. Another Western territory, this time being Utah, would shortly after grant women's suffrage, but for different reasons. The area was largely inhabited by members of the Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, after they were chased out of the Midwest some years previous. The official stance in D.C. was that one of the core religious tenets of the Saints' religion needed to be removed, that being polygamy. After slavery was abolished and black men gained voting rights in the 15th Amendment, many American reformers turned their attention from ending slavery to ending polygamy. Initially, some believed giving Utah women voting rights would politically empower them to end the practice, and the Latter-day Saints, on the other hand, believed that Mormon women would use their vote to show their support for the practice. They also thought giving women the right to vote would change the negative perceptions about the church and its treatment of women, and wanted to show that Mormon women were not oppressed, helpless, and enslaved as many believed. Finally, granting suffrage to women would strengthen support for the People's Party, a Utah political party recently organized by Mormons in opposition to the new Liberal Party, which was formed by non-Mormon settlers whose numbers were increasing in the territory. On February the 12th of 1870, Utah's acting governor John Schaffer, damn what a last name, a staunch anti-Mormonist, signed a women's suffrage bill that had unanimously passed the territorial legislature. This law granted voting rights in local and territorial elections for women, but not the right to run for or hold public office. Gaining the vote broadened Utah women's opportunities to participate in political life, however, and leaders from the Relief Society, which was the women's organization of the Latter-day Saints Church, developed programs to educate women about the political process and civic engagement, electing women to national conventions for women's suffrage. However, since giving Utah women the ability to vote did not end polygamy, anti-polygamists lobbied the U.S. Congress to pass laws pressuring the church to disavow polygamy, and it was the one sticking issue in preventing Utah from becoming a state. Several proposed anti-polygamy bills were also included measures to revoke women's suffrage, and Congress would eventually pass the Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887, with part of this legislation taking away the voting rights of all Utah women, whether they were Mormon or not, monogamous or polygamous, etc. And this was essentially enforced on the territory, yet this still wouldn't be the end of changing suffrage for Utah. In 1890, LDS Church President Wilford Woodruff officially ended the practice of polygamy. With this change in policy, Congress would once again invite Utah to the Union as a state, and during Utah's 1895 Constitutional Convention, delegates debated whether to include women's suffrage and the right to hold public office into the state's constitution. In contrast to other parts of the nation, most supported a woman's right to vote and to hold public office, with both national parties in Utah supporting these rights in their party platforms. Despite minor opposition, the delegates voted to include a clause in the Constitution that granted women suffrage and the right to hold public office. A few months later, Utah's male electorate voted overwhelmingly to approve the Constitution, and Utah women were given back the right to vote when Congress accepted Utah's Constitution and granted Utah statehood in 1896. Progress for women's suffrage did keep expanding at this point. In 1893, a referendum in Colorado made that state the second one to give women suffrage and the first state where the men voted to give women the right to vote. A few years later, Idaho approved a constitutional amendment with a statewide vote giving women the right to vote, bringing the number up to 4 states. One after another, Western states granted the right of voting to their female citizens, with the only opposition being presented by the liquor interests and the machine politicians. Oregon passed women's suffrage in 1912, and Montana voted to end the discrimination against women in 1914, with them proceeding to elect the first female to the United States Congress in 1916 by the name of Jeanette Rankin. Arizona became a state in 1912, but it had many more conservative Southerners, and its new constitution did not include women's suffrage. Activists in the state would form the Arizona Equal Suffrage Association and launched a campaign to win that vote. Their tactics were to reach out to progressive organizations for endorsements, winning the support of influential political and civic leaders. The AESA sent delegations to the Republican and Democratic state conventions to argue for their support. This tactic would eventually work, and women's suffrage was added on in the general election that was held on November the 5th of 1912. California approved suffrage in 1911 and had the first Chinese American women voting. Yet suffrage wouldn't extend too far east, at least not yet. Illinois was the first state to the east of the Mississippi River to give women the right to vote in 1913, but they were limited to presidential elections and local elections, not being able to vote for any state Congress members or governors. Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio would pass similar bills by 1916, with Arkansas passing a bill that allowed women to only vote in primaries, but not the general elections. Now, with all these states granting women the right to vote in some capacity, some may wonder what was the driving factor behind this expansion of suffrage. In 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt succeeded Susan B. Anthony as the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Catt revitalized the organization, turning the focus of it to the passage of the federal amendment, while simultaneously supporting women who wanted to pressure their states to pass suffrage legislation. The strategy had several goals, with women in the states that had already granted presidential suffrage would focus on passing a federal suffrage amendment. Women who believed they could influence their state legislators would focus on amending their state constitutions, and southern states would focus on gaining primary suffrage. Simultaneously, the organization worked to elect congressmen who supported suffrage for women. By 1915, there were a large, powerful organization with 44 state chapters and over 2 million members. When World War I started, women in 8 states had already won the right to vote, but support for the federal amendment was still rather weak. When the US officially entered World War I, Kat made the controversial decision to support the war effort, despite the widespread pacifist sentiment of many of her colleagues and supporters. As women joined the labor force to replace men that were serving in the military, NAWSA organizers argued that women's sacrifices made them deserving of the vote, and in 1917, the so-called Anthony Amendment was reintroduced to the House and Senate, with it being debated heavily. An offshoot women's suffrage organization called the National Woman's Party protested outside of the White House for weeks at a time, demanding universal suffrage. Eventually, over 150 would be arrested, and they were only released from prison due to public pressure. In 1918, President Wilson faced a difficult midterm election and would have to confront the issue of women's suffrage directly. 15 states had extended equal voting rights to women, and by this time, Wilson himself supported the federal amendment. The House of Representatives would pass the proposal by one vote, and while Wilson made a speech for the amendment in the Senate, it failed by 2 votes. For 6 months, the proposal would be brought before the House and the Senate 5 different times, each time just barely failing. But finally, in the June of 1919, the Senate passed the proposal, 56 in favor, 25 against, and now it would be up to the states to ratify it before it got added to the Constitution. Kat and the National Woman's Party set to work trying to push states to ratify the amendment, 3 of which were signed on in less than a week. By August of 1920, the required number of states had ratified the amendment, and thus the 19th Amendment was officially codified into the US Constitution, putting this chapter of history somewhat to rest.
There is one place in the world where the USSR has yet to fall. Located along the Dniester River, Transnistria has only had a very recent history, being ultimately spawned from the death of the USSR. But its historical roots dawn from 1924 with the creation of the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Here, the Moldovan Republic consisted of Transnistria, as well as a section of land surrounding the city of Balta in present-day Ukraine. In 1940, the Soviets would forcibly annex the remaining held lands of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, re-administering the previous autonomous republic into the Moldovan Soviet Republic, i.e. the modern nation of Moldova. Transnistria would spawn from a change of policies within the USSR that started in the 80s under Mikhail Gorbachev's administration. His admin, outside of being a meme machine, brought changes that allowed regional powers to have vastly more freedom in the administration and economies of the areas that they oversaw. While this was originally done to try and revitalize the Soviet system, it instead brought about a new wave of national identity across the USSR. In Moldova, there was a new wave of pro-Romanian nationalism, and a new political party, the Popular Front of Moldova, would be formed, rapidly becoming an extremely powerful force within the Republic. In a series of demands to the Supreme Soviet, the Popular Front called for Moldovan to be the only state language instead of Russian, and the return to the use of the Latin alphabet, as well as recognize the shared identity of Moldovans and Romanians. Ethnic minorities felt threatened by the prospects of Russian being removed as the official language, which served as a medium for communication. There was a further fear that there would either be a reunification of Moldova and Romania into a single state, or that the more radical, ethnocentric, and anti-minority sections of the Popular Front would take over should Moldovan independence be achieved. The region that encompassed Transnistria in particular held this fear, as they differed vastly more ethnically and linguistically than the rest of Moldova. Russians and Ukrainians made up nearly 80% of the population and engaged in vastly more trade with the Ukrainian neighbors. To counteract this fear, an organization was created in early '89 to fight back against these changes. This organization was dubbed the United Work Collective Council, and they called for massive strikes to take place across the region should the Supreme Soviet give in to the Popular Front's demands. Well, the Supreme Soviet would give in to these demands in August of '89, and when the decision was announced, the Collective Council called for massive strikes, and over 200,000 would take up the call throughout September. While the strike would fail to ultimately overturn the decision, the left side of the Dniester River, i.e. Transnistria, would be largely controlled by members loyal to the council. As winter grew on, lines were being drawn on the political stage. The Communist Party, currently in control, was being attacked from both the nationalists of the Popular Front as well as the pro-Russian forces within Transnistria, and elections were just around the corner. The Republic-wide elections in February of 1990 cemented the lines of division. Of the 380 seats within the Supreme Soviet, the Popular Front would win 101 seats outright, the Collective Council taking 80 seats, and the Communists 53. Now, if you look at the election results yourself, you'll notice that this number is vastly different. The reason for this was because the Communist Party were the only party legally allowed under the law, but individuals could run without a party backing, hence the large number of independents and large number of communist members in the assembly. Both sides had allies, but in the end, the Popular Front would come out victorious, naming Mitra Duc as prime minister. On April the 27th of 1919, the Supreme Soviet of Moldova set about adopting a new flag. This new flag, now the modern flag of Moldova, was based along the yellow, red, and blue of the Romanian flag, an act of open defiance against the Soviet Union. Within days, the eastern cities of Tiraspol, Bender, and Ripnia, and others under collective council control would defy the Soviets' decision, raising the USSR flag in its place. The Moldovan government in Chisinau passed through a law to make the new flag legally binding, and while the Supreme Soviet was supportive of the Chisinau government, they were unwilling to enforce the legal actions required to make the collective council comply. As a direct result of this new flag law, an independence referendum would be held across cities under collective council control, with the results, which may or may not have been tampered with, showing 95% support for independence. September the 2nd of 1990 would see the creation of the Prestorovian Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. Try to say that name 5 times fast, with Tiraspol as their acting capital. The proclamation of this republic would instantly cause civil unrest across the proclaimed region. More ardent supporters would attempt to take over the police and custom office in Dubasari, a city still loyal to the Chisinau government. The one bridge over the Dniester would be blockaded, cutting the city off from the central government. After multiple hours, police would open fire, spilling the first blood in what would become the Transnistrian War. For the rest of '91, pro-Moldovan and pro-Transnistrian forces would clash over the territory. The police and militia forces within Dubasari would stay loyal to the Moldovan government, and the city itself would be besieged. Major action would flare following the dissolution of the USSR in December of '91, and a flood of arms into the former Soviet republics. Both sides would ramp up their forces, and battle lines would be established. In the north, stretched from Dubasari to Roge, would be a pro-Moldovan foothold on the eastern side of the river, held primarily by the 120-strong police force of Dubasari. In the south, the Transnistrian city of Bender acted as a bulwark against the captive Tiraspol, surrounded on 3 sides by pro-Moldovan villages. Not only was the city a bulwark towards the capital, but Bender also housed the Russian 14th Guard Army, a 14,000-strong professional force that would fight alongside and equip the PMR militia, and proved to be critical as fighting flared up. Cossack volunteers flooded into the PMR, and Russian Vice President Alexander Ruskoy would call to a crowd in Trizpol to continue the fight for independence. Moldovan President Mircea Sigro quickly ushered his countrymen to join the newly created army. Supplied with weaponry and officers from Romania, 4,000 men would answer his call to arms in mid-March of '92. The start of April would see the decisive battles of the campaign. April 2nd had PMR forces surge towards Dubasari, taking the majority of the city by the end of the day. Local Moldovan militia and police would be ferried across the river, taking positions around the three main villages to the north of the city. Just south, a second bridgehead would be formed, as Moldovan militia would cross at Vadovoda, taking the villages of Parada, Konista, and Dorosaya. Further south still, a standoff between Bender police and PMR forces would escalate into urban warfare on June the 19th. 2,000 Moldovan troops would rush in an attempt to take control of the situation, but they were met by tanks of the 14th Army, who prevented the full occupation of Bender. Hundreds of fighters would continue to move in for both sides, but by the 22nd, Moldovan forces would be pushed out of the city, and the 14th Army, numbering nearly 10,000 professional soldiers, were making plans to march towards Chisinau itself. Knowing that the hastily raised forces couldn't fend off a fully equipped army, Snegro would arrange for a ceasefire with Russian President Yeltsin. As a stipulation of the ceasefire, a combination of Russian, Moldovan, and PMR battalions would be created under a joint command to oversee the region and make sure that peace would be held. Even with the conflict being frozen following the '92 ceasefire, a resolution has yet to be found. Surveys taken post-2003 in the disputed territory saw upwards of 90% of the population still either wanting independence or integration within Russia, though the results of said surveys were likely tampered with. Funnily enough, unlike other Russian-backed separatist states, Transnistria isn't even recognized by the Russian Federation, just by the fellow separatist states of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Astrakhan. Russian troops numbering 2,000 have persisted in the territory since the tail end of 2003, and all attempts for international pressure to have them removed has thus far been in vain, and time will only tell how these generation-long battles would finally come to.
The quick collapse of France during World War II was a shock to many in the world. Its colonial empire was largely administered from a German puppet government of Vichy France, and there was a major worry from the Allied High Command of antagonizing the puppet French government enough that they'd openly fight against the Allied forces. However, other nations, not familiar with either faction, saw this as an opportunity to gain influence at the expense of a heavily weakened French nation. In today's episode, we'll be looking at one of these conflicts, the Franco-Thai War. Before talking about the war itself, we need a bit of background information. The fall of mainland France in mid-1940 shocked many in the world, who expected a repeat of the slow, grinding attrition of the First World War. With France occupied, a puppet state, Vichy France, was created. This government oversaw the vast colonial empire that the nation wielded. Yet, protection of this was dodgy at best, and some foreign powers saw this as an opportunity to themselves expand in influence. Japan saw the solitary French colony in the area, Indochina, as a prime target, and issued ultimatums on June the 19th. This ultimatum demanding the closure of all supply routes to China and the admission of a 40-man Japanese inspection team on that demand. Initially, Kato refused the demand, stating that such a thing would breach sovereignty. However, once he became aware of the Japanese land and naval units in position, he accepted their demands. Knowing that his forces couldn't hope to defend the territory, and that assistance from the mainland or even other colonies wasn't forthcoming. On the 22nd of June, more demands were brought forward, them being naval basing rights at Guangzhou and the total closure of the Chinese border by July the 7th. On July the 3rd, another demand was presented, air bases and the rights to transit combat troops through Indochina.
Kato was replaced before the government responded to the two new demands, and the new governor Jean de Cou urged the government to reject them. Jean knew that the colony wasn't strong enough to defeat the Japanese, but saw it as strong enough to deter them from invading in the first place. The still neutral United States was contracted in providing aircraft to the colony, and de Joux had over 50,000 men under his direct command, with over half of them being regulars. While this force was the largest of any French colony at the time, it wasn't enough to deter the Japanese. Plans were drawn up, and yet another ultimatum issued on September the 20th, signing that Japanese troops would enter the territory regardless of French response. The invasion started on September the 22nd of 1940, and heavy fighting erupted along the northern border, but the French were only able to hold off for a day before needing to retreat, following the same path that they did during the Sino-French War 60 years prior. Hint and click on my video on that subject here. By the 26th, fighting had died down and the Japanese were allowed to station tens of thousands of units within Indochina as part of the peace, but they didn't do so just yet, fearing retaliation from the Americans, who had already been trying to force Japan to leave China. After this fighting with the Japanese, the Thai government, the only independent nation in South Asia, saw this as a golden opportunity to gain back territory that they had lost years prior. Franco-Thai tensions had sparked during the past, and disagreements between where the boundary actually was had been ongoing debate for many years. In the previous century, Thailand had to give up a large amount of territory that was now held by Indochina. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, negotiations between the two nations saw a possibility of some small border adjustments. Now, however, Thai Major General Phlek Pamsogram saw the weak governmental response to the Japanese occupation as a great way to get the land back that they wanted. Getting lukewarm acceptance from the Japanese, Phlek drew up plans for war. In November of 1940, Thai units started probing Indochina's defenses with artillery strikes and border raids, with a full-on invasion starting in January the following year. Thai forces were a mixture of Western and European material. The Air Force consisted of American-built Kossars and Curtiss Hawks, with a supplement of Japanese Mitsubishi bombers. The Army fielded German crop guns and 30 British Vickers tanks, as well as 5 dozen Carden Lloyd tankettes. The Navy was comprised mainly of torpedo boats manufactured in Italy, but also 2 Japanese-built coastal defense ships. And while not large by World War II standards, Thailand was able to field about 60,000 well-equipped and trained men in 4 separate armies. Even with the advance warning, Indochina faced a dire predicament. Though the army was not significantly smaller at 50,000 men, only 12,000 of these were regular units, and the Indochinese army also had the duty of maintaining order within its own borders. Native rebellions plagued the colony, drawing soldiers away from the front to police the local populace. Against Thai armor, the French could only field one operational tank company, a World War I era light tank, the Renault FT. While they had a more powerful navy, that being a light cruiser and 4 medium-sized warships, their air force was considerably inferior, being able to muster only 100 obsolete aircraft, made up mostly of the Potsa 25, a 1920s single-engine bomber. To make matters worse, the colony was cut off from the home country, and local shortages ensured materials such as oil went to Japan first, and the British in India and beyond prevented Vichy ships from ever reaching the distant colony. In the first few days of fighting, Thai pilots took the skies and never relinquished them, while the accuracy of Thai fighter bombers surprised French commanders. The Grand War was a little different. Just a week into the conflict, the Thai army gained control of Laos and most of the Mekong River's western bank. Advances into Cambodia proved more difficult, however. Thailand sent the bulk of its invasion forces into the disputed Cambodian province of Battambang, but strong resistance from native colonial rifles kept Thai gains to much less than in the Laotian invasion. The French attempted to counterattack at Yan Dan Kum, but the result was disastrous. The Thai air wing managed to control the sky with impunity, and the thick jungle made unit coordination almost impossible. It was only a handful of legionnaires that managed to prevent a complete rout, as they managed to blow apart some of the Thai tanks and held the advance off for long enough to let the main French column retreat. Yet a French victory did come in from the sea. In the early morning of January the 17th of 1941, a French naval squadron caught a Thai naval detachment by surprise off of Cochin Island. The subsequent Battle of Cochin was a tactical victory for the French, and resulted in the sinking of 2 Thai torpedo boats and heavy damage to a coastal defense ship, with the French suffering only minimal casualties. This boosted French morale and reignited resolve within the colony. In turn, the Thais had lost the initiative and were stalled in making any more advances into Cambodia, and by early February, fighting had stalled all along the line. Fearing that the French might get the upper hand, Japan showed up in force at the Mekong Delta and brokered an armistice between the two powers. On May the 9th, a formal peace treaty was signed in Tokyo, officially ending the war. The brokered peace treaty forced France to cede northwestern Cambodia and 2 Laoan enclaves to Thailand, yet made the Thais pay millions in restitution to the Vichy government. In appreciation, the now Prime Minister Pibble Sagram secretly pledged military support for Japan should Japan ever engage in war with the United Kingdom, and a monument was constructed, the Victory Monument in Bangkok, to commemorate the victory over a European power. What the ceasefire agreement demonstrated was who controlled events in Southeast Asia. Japan made it apparent that Indochina's independence rested at Tokyo's whim. Japan also allowed it to legitimately increase its presence in the area and gain further access to the corridors that led straight through Thailand to Malaysia and Burma. Fleck, who had hoped for greater cooperation with his country's Asian neighbor, realized Japan had no interest in his nation except for a strategic position. He feared an invasion in the future, and later secretly approached the British and Americans, seeking aid if Japan invaded Thailand. Fleck was right to be worried in this regard, as on December the 8th of 1941, Japan would invade Thailand in combination with a strike south and bombing of Pearl Harbor, putting an end to this chapter in history and starting the printing of a new one. Alaska has been called the final frontier. Located thousands of miles away from the original colonies of the United States, and still over 1,000 miles away from the continental US. It, along with Hawaii, are 2 of the 7 external territories of the United States. Yet only these 2 are equal in terms of the rest of the states, with the right to vote in the presidential election and have representatives in the US House and Senate. While Alaska has had a rather recent history with the US, what may be interesting to learn is that it was colonized by a European power before the United States was even an independent country. What was the power, you may ask? In this video, we will be looking at the Russian colonization of Alaska. No, not like that. Since the Russian independence in the 15th century, land to the east was seen by many as a mythical place, homeland of the horse nomad, home to a secret power that great empires held, and fur. Don't forget about the fur. Russian colonization of Siberia was a centuries-long endeavor, and one that would catapult the state to have a massive stretch of territory, even though limited populations existed the further east they claimed. The last major expedition of this kind was that of Seymon Desniev back in 1648. Desniev managed to sail around the eastern cape of Siberia, sail into the Bering Strait, and go up the Androy River to found an outpost. A land bridge between Siberia and the Americas had been believed to have existed, and while Desniev was likely very unaware of what was discovered, he proved that no such land bridge existed, and was the first recorded individual to have sailed through the Bering Strait. However, the debate still raged as to whether or not a land bridge did exist, as his discovery was not relayed to the Russian government. It wouldn't be until late 1724 when Tsar Peter the Great once again called for expeditions. Early next year was the first Comanche expedition headed by Vitus Bering. This expedition was set out to confirm if a strait existed between Asia and North America. This he managed to accomplish, and it proved useful insights into the geography of eastern Siberia. In total, the expedition surveyed more than 3,500 kilometers of the sea, which was later named after Bering. Its map of the area was later used by all Western European cartographers. But Bering's work was not yet done. In 1733, Peter once again called upon his services, funding what would be known as the Great Northern Expedition, one of the largest expeditions within all of history. The expedition had a few goals, one being to find and map eastern Siberia, attempt to find a northern sea route from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and, if possible, explore the western shores of Northern America. All total, over 3,000 individuals were involved in this expedition, and it cost the Russian state 1.5 million rubles, which was 1/6 of its annual budget at the time. That would very roughly translate to around 500 million US dollars in modern currency. Again, very roughly. This expedition discovered Alaska to the Europeans, as well as the Aleutian Islands, 4 more island groups, and heavily mapped out the eastern Siberian and Creole Islands. However, the inability for Bering to travel above the northeastern tip of Siberia did crush any dreams of an Atlantic-Pacific route, much to the dismay of Tsar Peter. Bering himself, work completed, did not get to enjoy any reprieve. After leaving the Alaskan coast in 1742, his ships were grounded in a storm and torn to pieces. The crew managed to winter over on an island, but there, Bering fell ill and died, buried during his greatest discovery. The survivors of his crew managed to return a year later, bringing back with them high-quality otter pelts, something that interested many individuals indeed. From 1743 on, small groups of hunters would make the 3-year-long trek across Siberia and sometimes over into Alaska. Many of them would settle instead somewhere along the trek, staying in little outposts that they made along the way. It wouldn't be until 1774 that the first permanent settlement was created in Alaska, that of Unalaska. Seriously, that is its name. The Russians traded with the native Aleut people on the island since the mid-1750s. Conflict a few years later between the native population and Russian trappers led to a trading post and later permanent settlement being established. Many of the trappers enslaved the native population and had them do the hunting instead, taking hostages or family members to force them to hunt. As the riches of the pelts became widely spread, competition between various Russian companies occurred, and mass enslavement of the Aleut population followed. With the accession of Catherine the Great in 1763, she called for peaceful relations with the Alaskan natives, and while some settlers were more than able to live in a peaceful cooperation, others continued the hostage and family splitting, leading to just a few companies controlling the entire operations within the colony. As the animal population declined, the natives were forced into worse and worse conditions to meet the demand of pelt quotas. This led to a number of violent skirmishes between the natives and the Russian colonizers. The natives did manage to secure a few victories, but these were met with heavy retaliation. Mass murder, villages being burned, equipment being destroyed or stolen, decimated the already weakened native population, as disease wiped out over 80% of the population by the start of the 19th century. The largest of these retaliations being the Awak Massacre in 1784. Grigory Shelikov, the man that essentially ran the whole Alaskan colony, ordered the massacre after the natives resisted the construction of a settlement on Sikalaki Island. Initial skirmishes had the natives retreat to Refuge Rock, where upwards of 3,000 were slaughtered. Since then, the island, even to modern day, lacks a permanent population. This act of brutality was too much for many native chiefs, who surrendered to the Russians thereafter. Nevertheless, native resistance was strong in some areas until 1804, when the last major battle took place, that being at the Battle of Sitka. Even with the natives largely quelled, the Russians never fully colonized Alaska, sticking instead to the coast and shunning the interior. But by this time, the downfall of the colony was inevitable. It was never really particularly profitable in the first place, and the fact that supply ships from the home country only arrived every few years to drop off provisions made the colony extremely dependent on American and British food and material. This, both of whom were eventually able to cut into the already meager profits of the pelt trade. Even still, an uske, or claim of sovereignty, was proclaimed in 1821, claiming all of Alaska and most of the Pacific Northwest as Russian territory, with all trading with foreign vessels prohibited. Only once was this claim of sovereignty actually enforced, when a Russian sloop captured an American merchant vessel, but after protests from Washington, the ship was released. The demand of no foreigners was quickly put to the wayside though, as once again, the colonists needed the materials desperately from the American populace, and they were running out of ways to pay. The British Hudson Bay Company was leased southern Alaska in 1839 in return for provisions and materials, while the Americans were given hunting rights for the same resources. By the 1860s, the Russian government was ready to abandon its American colony. Zealous overhunting had severely reduced the fur-bearing animal population. This, combined with the difficulties of supplying and protecting such a distant colony, as shown by the recent Crimean War, reduced interest in the territory. After the Union victory in the American Civil War, an offer was once again extended to the Americans for the purchase of Alaska. Secretary of State William H. Stewart viewed this as a golden opportunity to distract people from the tensions back at home, as many in the Congress were heavily debating the course for Reconstruction, and the Johnson's administration had alienated many in their own party. The negotiations were completed after a long night, with the US purchasing Alaska for $7.2 million, or 2 cents an acre. Seward and many other Americans believed that Asia would become an important market for the country's products, and expected that Alaska would serve as a base for American trade with Asia, as well as heavily boost American power in the Pacific. Also, British Columbia now stood largely surrounded by American territory, and many were eyeing the land as something that the United States would take soon in the future. The Treaty of Purchase passed the United States Senate with 37 votes for and 2 against. Most newspapers and a fair number of the public were in support or at least neutral to the purchase. Some did consider it a folly or little more than an icebox, but others saw the potential value in the animal and lumber trade, with hunting still being the mainstay of the Alaskan economic output, until the Klondike Gold Rush in 1896, in which over 100,000 people traveled to the so-called icebox in search of fortune. But that is where the story of the Russian colony ends, an enterprise that was ruled brutally and violently, all in the name of profit.
Throughout history, the world has seen the rise and fall of hundreds upon hundreds of empires. And in that history as well, nations that today that are rather small and minor on the global scale may very well have been a great power in its history. One such example is that of the Swedish Empire, an empire that lasted for little more than a century, reaching its apex in the middle of its existence. So, how did this small state become one of the strongest empires in Europe? And to answer that question, we need some history. We'll start by looking at the Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union was a union between the crowns of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway from its establishment in 1397 until its dissolvement in 1521. This was supposed to be a personal rather than a political union, but Norway and Sweden were largely left to the whim of the Danish politically, as they were the strongest partner of the union. This was further compounded when the Norwegian nobility was largely wiped out by the Black Death, and the power in the union was largely split between the Danes and the Swedes. The Danish monarch often wanted to consolidate the nation to make it more unified internally. However, the nobility of each state wanted the opposite, so an eternal struggle between the wills of the nobility and the monarch constantly undermined the stability in the union. This, combined with costly wars against trading partners in North Germany, which had the union on the losing side, constant tax raises, diverging interests, and a shift towards Danish dominance,
set in motion a series of revolts by the Swedes, which resulted in their full independence in 1523. Soon after its independence, Sweden was able to gradually consolidate and centralize unlike its European neighbors. But how are they able to do this? Well, there were two reasons. First, Sweden had never been a feudal state. At the start of the 16th century, the free-holding Swedish peasants amounted to around 62% of the population, and they also owned around 50% of the arable land. The nobility held only 22% of the land, while the rest was largely split between the merchant class, the clergy, and various others. Swedish peasants then, compared to continental serfs, were relatively well off, as well as motivated, and they were able to fight for their rights, and they violently resisted any attempt to usurp them or to encroach on their rights. And they also had included representation in the Riksdag, the Swedish estate's parliament. This consolidation effort was further helped by the Danes, who, due to their action known as the Stockholm Bloodbath, not only ended a century-long civil war between the Swedish nobility, but it also largely forced support towards Gustav Vasa. Gustav was able to cancel a good portion of the national debt by taking the majority of church ties in the nation, while also trying to implement the spread of the Reformation across Sweden without officially breaking with Rome. The ties collecting and the slow spread of Reformation would cause around a dozen peasant rebellions from the 1520s to the 1540s, the largest of which was the Arastook War in 1542. But after that point, local rebellions against the Swedes were very rare and easily put down. Sweden was also able to benefit from the weakening of its immediate neighbors. The Hansa was weakened from outside conflict, and the Danes were embroiled in a major civil war. During this time, Gustav Vasa was able to develop a very effective administration, which would stay a massive advantage for centuries. Sweden was ahead of most of the world in using its resources effectively. The nobility was not strong enough to resist, and they became administrators and officers for the state, rather than states within the state as it was in many other nations. Gustav also forced through an inventory of all the land in the nation, essentially meaning who owned it, how productive it was, and thus how much tax was owned on it. This, combined with the nation being rich with natural resources, which included access to copper and silver, and most of the peasants being well enough off that they were able to grow some type of cash crop, allowed for a coin-based economy to replace bartering earlier than in other nations, which only further increased the effectiveness of the economy. Sweden would find itself surrounded by adverse or hostile powers though. Denmark-Norway was, understandably, still a bit miffed at an independent Sweden, especially once Danish attempts to gain influence in the Livonian Order were thwarted. Russia in the east had long fought over settlements in Finland against the Swedish settlers, especially once the Swedes got involved in Livonia and Estonia by the mid-1550s. And to the south, Poland was eyeing the Swedish Baltic trade domination, and they wished to overtake that profitable market. Potential allies in North Germany from the various duchies and free cities also proved to be futile for the nation. And while they were still in tense relation with the Danes, the war between the new Danish Union and the North Germans had largely ended, and instead the Swedes were in massive debt to many of these North German states, with one in particular, that being the free city of Lübeck, holding roughly 60% of the remaining debt from the Liberation War, and they intended to make sure that that debt was paid off. To this end, the Danes, Lübeckians, and the Poles allied together to try and take out Sweden once and for all. This timing was perfect too, as war was raging over Russia in the 30-year-long Livonian War, a war which surprisingly all of these combatants as well as the Swedes were already allies in. After a 7-year-long war against Sweden, it would end with a status quo but official dissolvement of the Kalmar Union. The first major action against Sweden had failed, and it would only get tougher from this point on. As from the war against Russia, Sweden would get Estonia from the crumbling Livonian Confederacy, and they gained the important trading city of Reval to go with Viborg on the opposing side of the Bay of Finland. Sweden would come under a personal union with Poland near the end of the 16th century, as Sigismund Vasa III was crowned as the King of Sweden in 1592, and as a regency council, take his spot in ruling over Sweden itself while he ruled over Poland. Religious tensions would boil over shortly after, however, as Sigismund would try to force through a number of Catholic churches and Catholic policies into Sweden, much to the chagrin of the Swedish nobility and general public. Duke Charles would wage a rebellion after Sigismund ended up pseudo-forcing him to resign in 1597. The rebellion against Poland would last for just a few months, with Sigismund losing the war, largely due to the lack of noble support within Sweden, and Duke Charles would end up accepting the Swedish crown in 1604. From here, Sweden would see a massive amount of military victories for the next number of years. In the Ingrian War against Russia in the early 17th century, Sweden would capture Ingria and the mouth of the Neva River, which meant that almost all trade to and from Russia had to go through Swedish tolls, and this created a massive source of income for the Swedish state. From campaigns against the Poles and Russians throughout the rest of the century, Gustav Adolphus II would adopt a new form of shock cavalry, and he created the first light mobile artillery as well as refined infantry tactics. After this, though, Sweden would run the rest of the century at nearly constant war. They would use the loot and pillaging of enemy lands to keep its economy going. And this was helped by irregular French subsidies, especially during the 30 Years' War. The start of the Swedish Empire is generally credited to this time, more so when they beat the Danish and Norwegians in the Torstenson War in 1645. And following the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, Silesia and Pomerania would be added to the Swedish fold. Yet, the Swedes would not be done in their quest for expansion. In 1655, the nation would wage a 5-year-long war against the Poles, with eventually expanding to include most of Eastern Europe. From this war, while the Swedish-American colonies would be lost, the Swedes would expand to their largest territorial apex that the nation would ever have, with them annexing the Danish-Norwegian provinces of Skåne, Åland again, Breckland, Brussland, and Ven. Yet, this would be the end of the good news for Sweden, as the future for them would hold little more than weakness, instability, and financial hardship.
The Soviet Union and China, two nations which were, at least for a stint of time, seen as close allies. And indeed, the Soviets were de facto allies to the Chinese during the Second World War, and for years into the Cold War. Yet, as is usual with history, things aren't as clean and clear as are generally portrayed, and the two would fight one another in a multitude of conflicts that are rarely discussed in the retelling of history. While minor border skirmishes are common and easy to ignore, there was no mere small skirmish, and instead would see the largest deployment of the Red Army until the Soviet entry into the Second World War. It is July of 1929, and war has begun. The Sino-Soviet conflict stemmed from ownership disputes on who owned the Chinese Eastern Railway, a railway that directly connected the major cities of Vladivostok, Seoul, Pyongyang, Harbin, and Beijing, which was the only railway that connected China to their northern provinces. The Russians and later Soviets had great interest in the line as it provided a significantly shortened route to and from Vladivostok. The Russians had occupied northern Manchuria during the 1894 Sino-Japanese War and were granted the rights to build the Eastern Railway by the Jin government. In 1898, construction of a 550-mile spur line began at Harbin, leading southward through eastern Manchuria along the Liaodong Peninsula to the ice-free port at Lushun, which the Russians were fortifying and developing into a first-class naval base and marine coastal station for its Far Eastern Fleet. While construction on this line would be completed by 1903, the Russo-Japanese War would see the line at Lushun, as well as the majority of the Southern Korean line, fall directly under Japanese control. On July the 25th of 1919, the Soviets' Assistant Commissioner of Foreign Affairs, Lev Karakin, had issued a manifesto to the Chinese government, promising them the return of the Eastern Railway to their control at no cost to the government. It would take some years before the two governments met for a greater discussion of the railway control, and a secret protocol would be signed on March the 14th of 1924. The protocol stated that all previous agreements, treaties, and commissions between the Chinese and the former Russian Empire were to be annulled, and a joint commission will later revisit and revise all of them. In regards to the railway, though, a major obstacle stood in the way of Soviet-Chinese management of the line, and that was Jean Julian, the warlord that had control over the Mukden government, and thus the majority of the northern Manchurian land. With this complication, the Soviets pushed their secret protocol on the central government, while striking a deal with Julian himself. They promised him full control of choosing which Chinese officials would be on the joint board of the CER, and granted him just shy of half of the total control of the railway as well. Here, the Soviets managed to spring their trap. As well as Julian would have control over the Chinese officials appointed, the secret protocol signed earlier with the Chinese government gave the Soviets nearly total control over appointments, meaning that the majority of the board would be manned by Soviet officials. This foreign management would continue on for a number of years until 1929, when Chinese authorities stormed the Soviet consulate in Harbin, arresting the general manager of the CER, his assistant, and other Soviet citizens. The Soviets would retaliate by arresting Chinese citizens within the USSR and cutting off diplomatic relations with the Chinese. Calls for war came from many members in the Soviet cabinet, and on August the 6th, Joseph Stalin would create the Special Red Banner Far Eastern Army, commanded by Valery Blucher. Nearly 20% of all Soviet armed forces would be mustered into this army, numbering a total of 110 men, and this would be the largest use of Soviet troops since the Civil War until their entry into World War II. Jean, getting intel of the gathering Soviet forces, quickly raised his own army, gathering well over 200,000 men in a combination of veterans, standing regulars, policemen, and local militia. At its core would be 3,000 white Russian immigrants that had migrated to northern Manchuria years previously, and this, along with his personal guard units, would act as the hardened core of the Manchurian army. The first major action would take place at Chalonor on August the 18th. The Chinese quickly retreated from the town, but as the Soviets advanced further, they were faced with deep entrenchment lines, supported by machine guns. An attempt to push them out failed, and while the Soviets would keep a hold of the city, it would cost them 200 casualties. Skirmishes would continue for a number of months along the border, with small towns and villages trading hands back and forth as both forces mustered to their full strength, and it wouldn't be until October when the next major move would take place. Blucher had developed a plan of attack that centered around rapid envelopment and preventing any escape should a siege take place. Firstly, his aim was to destroy the Chinese naval forces in the area, massively slowing down the resupply and reinforcement of the forward units. With control of the waterways, he hoped to be able to transport his own army around the Chinese in Manchuria and swallow their armies up in whole. Or, if that couldn't be accomplished, then have his men march south, taking Yamsui, then head towards Harbin. Putting his plan into motion, the Amir Flotilla, which consisted of 4 relatively modern Typhoon-class river monitors and smaller craft, would engage the main Chinese fleet at the Battle of La Yishui. The Soviet victory here allowed them to land troops and capture the city of Tonian. With the loss of the city, Chinese forces retreated back to Yansui and dug in for the next attack. Off to the west, Soviet forces would clear the border town of Manchuria on November the 18th and quickly occupy up to the Bering Lake. But before further action could take place, the two sides managed to come to the table and negotiated a peace settlement. In the Haberas Protocol, signed on December the 13th, the terms simply stated that the parties were to return to the status quo of the 1924 agreement over the railway, effectively giving the Soviets majority control again, and any territory occupied was to be returned to the original owners. The conflict will leave Manchuria in a power vacuum, and the Japanese, long since eyeing to face their centuries-long continental rival, wouldn't let this opportunity to slip past them, but that is a topic for another time.
When looking at colonial maps of Africa, most of the continent was divided between the European powers, the only exceptions being the Ethiopians, who essentially fought off colonialization, and one other on the opposite side of the continent, Liberia. However, this nation is a remnant of pre-colonial times. It was the attempt of African colonization by the United States of America. The American Colonization Society was set up in December of 1816 by just elected President James Monroe, future President Andrew Jackson, politician Henry Clay, among others. The main goal was an establishment of a colony in Africa for free black Americans to go to. Some of the founding members viewed this as vital towards protecting slave property, while others and a good portion of the public supporters were abolitionists and never had much support in the Deep South. The organization raised around $50,000 in donation and membership fees from sympathizers during its first 10 years. But its biggest early source of income was the US government itself, where in 1819, Congress authorized a payment of $100,000 to the ACS. In 1920, the ACS sent its first colonists to West Africa, consisting of 91 people, 88 blacks and 3 whites, on board a ship called the Elizabeth. They initially based themselves in the British colony of Sierra Leone before searching the coast for a place to establish their own settlement, where more than a quarter of the colonists died of yellow fever within 3 weeks. An agent of the ACS arranged to purchase an area of land called Cape Muzerado from the Gola people for the sum of $300. In January of 1822, the first settlers arrived at the settlement. They initially called their settlement Perseverance, but in 1824, they renamed it Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe, who was a supporter of the ACS. The settlement had its problems, including several conflicts with the local inhabitants who resisted the expansion of the colony, but they did manage to thrive, which was aided by the immigration of over 2,500 African Americans over the next 20 years. The success of Monrovia inspired the creation of several more American colonies in the region, such as the Maryland Colonization Society in 1831, funded by the state's taxpayers. Maryland appropriated $260,000 to be spent over 26 years to support the MSCS. Laws were also passed discriminating against free persons of color in Maryland in order to pressure them to emigrate. In February of 1834, the MSCS established its own colony in West Africa at Cape Palmas, 400 kilometers to the southeast of Monrovia. Its capital was named Harper City after a former U.S. Senator from Maryland. The colony itself was named the Republic of Maryland. The states of Louisiana and Mississippi also created their own settlement in Liberia at the mouth of the Sinai River. The movement was openly backed by the wealthy planters of the region as a way to reduce the number of African Americans in their states. However, only around 900 settlers actually left for West Africa. There were even New York and Pennsylvanian societies who set up the colony of Port Cresson in 1832, It was destroyed by the local Bassa people, but refounded 3 years later at Bassa Cove. The supporters of this effort included many evangelical Christians and Quakers, and their motive was to spread the gospel to Africa by planting a Protestant settlement in the region. The US government had sponsored this colonization effort financially, and its warships and marines offered their protection to the colonies when needed, but otherwise it took a hands-off approach and left their administration to the societies. Crucially, the settlements also had British goodwill. The main concern of the UK government in West Africa in this era was stamping out the slave trade, and the appearance of a free republic of ex-slaves in the region was a boost to the abolitionist cause. The colonists were almost all African Americans, but they brought with them the English language, Protestant religion, and Euro-American laws, customs, and attitudes to the natives who lived in West Africa. In 1838, the ACS colony of Monrovia united with the Quaker colony at Bassa Cove to form the Commonwealth of Liberia. Its population was 2,250, with 20 churches and 10 schools. A system of government was organized under the ACA back in the United States, and they appointed a governor with executive and judicial powers and a veto over legislation, but the colonists themselves would elect a legislative body. Thomas Buchanan, which was brother of a future US president, was the first governor. After his death in 1841, the ACS appointed a local resident, Joseph Roberts, who became the first black head of government in Liberia. The colony of Mississippi in Africa agreed to join Liberia in 1842. However, the Maryland one was unwilling and would remain separate until 1857. In 1846, the ACS urged Liberia to declare its independence, which it did the following year on July the 26th. There were two reasons for this. First, the ACS was nearing bankruptcy. The initial donation from the US government was long gone, and Congress was unwilling to advance more funds, while the colonization movement had never been as popular with the public as its founders had hoped, so donations were insufficient. Second, British merchants were complaining to their own government about attempts by the ACS to restrict or tax their trade with local African tribes along the coast. It was believed that if Liberia declared itself an independent sovereign state, it would be in a stronger position to resist British pressure to allow free trade. Liberia thus became an independent nation in 1847. This didn't stop the ACS from continuing its goal though, and even during the American Civil War, they sent roughly 200 to Africa, but the nation had a bit more to worry about at the time. However, the nation remained part of the US's sphere of influence, with a treaty under which the US government agreed to provide advice and assistance as required. American troops intervened in Liberia at least 5 times in the 19th and 20th centuries to prop up the colonial Liberian government against indigenous African resistance. Liberia's currency from its independence to 1907 was the Liberian dollar, which was pegged to the US dollar. Following the collapse of the economy in 1907, the country was threatened with a takeover by its creditors, but the United States preserved its independence. Following this and the start of the First World War, the United States started to take a more hands-off approach towards its former colony. And while the history of Liberia continues on even to this day, with many important events occurring within the nation, that will be a topic for another time. Out of the 50 states, Hawaii is the one state that is largely not mentioned in much capacity in regards to its acquisition and later statehood, and outside of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, isn't really mentioned much at all in detail. But how exactly did America get its 50th state? In this video, we'll be answering just that question. The settlement of Hawaii is debated to some degree, with ranges of settlement from 50 ACE all the way up to 950 ACE. By the year 1000, coastal farms were in existence, but it wasn't certain to what degree the islands themselves were settled for some time. By the 1500s, the interior of the Hawaiian Islands started to be settled, and eventually, each of the main islands were ruled by a native king. Captain James Cook was the first to discover the islands in the late 1770s, which, on the fourth voyage of his, is where he was killed following a dispute over a longboat. The Kingdom of Hawaii was established in 1795, with Kamehameha I acting as king. He waged a 15-year war to unify the entire archipelago, and Catholic missionaries started to flood into the island shortly after, causing a large section of the native population to die off due to disease, with a steady decline of population for over 100 years, as trade with other countries, primarily exporting sugar, fueled the economy. The political unity of the island was rather strong, but during the tenure of Queen Kamehameha, Catholic citizens were only given partial rights, with sections of the elite being Protestant. This led to French intervention in 1839 and 1849, and British occupation for a few months in 1843. Following the British occupation, Hawaii was recognized as independent by the US, France, and Britain, being the only non-European nation for the European powers to recognize at that time. American influence in the Hawaiian government began with US plantation owners demanding a say in kingdom politics, and led to the land being divided up largely by the say of local missionaries, leaving only 2% of the land to the common people, with the rest being split between the nobility and the sugar plantations. US control of Hawaii was considered vital for the defense of its west coast, especially Pearl Harbor, and it entered into a variety of negotiations to attempt to gain the islands directly under their influence or control. At the same time, the political unity on the island was being heavily hit, as twice in 1872 and 2 years later, the king of the islands died without naming an heir, and so an election was called for. With a small rebellion in response to the previous queen not winning, a rebellion that was put down by American-British troops, followed shortly by the Reciprocity Treaties of 1875, while allowing Hawaiian sugar to have free access to the American market, something that caused the sugar industry on the islands to boom tenfold, leading to even more plantation control over the political landscape. In January of 1887, the US began to lease Pearl Harbor, followed shortly by a rebellion against the king in July, which forced through a new constitution, a constitution that heavily weakened the king's powers, empowering the legislature and cabinet of the government, giving the public the power to vote in legislators. Kind of. This new constitution did allow foreign residents to vote, but blocked Asians as a whole from voting, who made up a fair chunk of the island's population. It also reinstated the literacy and personal wealth requirements for voting and increased them nearly 10 times over, meaning that essentially only white males wealthy from the sugar industry retained suffrage. While it allowed the monarchy to still technically exist, its power was severely limited. Queen Lilulukani acceded to the throne in January of 1891, who immediately received petitions from the native Hawaiian population for a new constitution. Over the next 2 years, she attempted to draft and gather support for a new constitution, but was constantly blocked by the legislature. And a section of European and American settlers established the quote-unquote Committee of Safety, who sought the island annexation into the United States, drawing from the same party that forced through the 1887 Constitution. In late January of 93, the committee called upon 1,500 men and overthrew the Queen with assistance from U.S. Marines. The Queen was banished and imprisoned in her palace again. The Marines acted as guards, and the Republic of Hawaii was proclaimed shortly after, with the goal of annexation within the United States. By this time, Grover Cleveland had become president, and Cleveland was anti-imperialist and thought Americans had acted shamefully in Hawaii. He withdrew the annexation treaty from the Senate and ordered an investigation into potential wrongdoing, but of course, the investigation led to nothing. Cleveland had aims to restore the Queen to her throne. A counter-revolution in the 3-day Wilcox Rebellion was an attempt to overthrow the president on the island and re-establish the monarchy's role. The rebellion failed after 3 main battles, and the Queen officially abdicated. The matter was prolonged until after Cleveland left office, When war broke out with Spain in 1898, the military significance of Hawaiian naval bases as a way station outweighed all other considerations. President William McKinley signed a joint resolution annexing the islands, much like the manner in which Texas joined the Union in 1845.
In a previous episode, we covered the largely forgotten U.S. expedition to Korea in 1871, caused after a massacre of an American merchant crew some years previous. But this wasn't the first time that the nation would be invaded in an effort to open it up to Western powers. Yet, unlike similar efforts in Japan, Korea managed to actually beat back this invader and prolong their isolationism for another decade to come. This is the French invasion of Korea. Western missionaries started arriving in Korea at the start of the 19th century, largely through the limited trade routes with Jin China, and with missionaries stealthing their way across the border into Korea proper. Bishop Simon Francais Béarnau would be appointed as the head of the Korean Catholic Church in 1856, having a congregation of roughly 17,000 Koreans that had converted. Originally, the government had turned a blind eye to the expansion of the Catholic Church in their nation, but that changed quickly after Hunseon Taowen became regent in 1864. When he took power, Taowen was determined to reform the government and strengthen their central control. He would lead an anti-corruption campaign, disciplining the royal clans, and he increased taxes on the aristocrats. While these economic reforms weren't particularly successful, his foreign policy was purely isolationist, and he forced through actions to isolate his nation from the rest of the world. And this included a suspicion and hostility towards the Catholic religion. These policies created a swell of patriotism and unity within Korea, but it was massively stalled any potential industrialization, and heavily limited its economic abilities outside of the limited Chinese trade. In January of 1866, Russian vessels would arrive off the coast of Korea, demanding that they open up their ports and give residency rights. The Christians within the court came to Taowen with a proposal of a potential alliance between the French and Korea against the Russian aggression. Taowen agreed to the meeting, but this ended up being a ruse, and when Simon Béarnau entered the capital to discuss terms, he would be captured and executed, with a greater roundup of French priests and converts starting after the execution. The reason behind the crackdown on Catholic members was largely by fearing that similar unrest that occurred in China would occur in Korea, such as the Taiping Rebellion, a rebellion that was largely fueled by Christian fervor, and a fear that Western nations would use the greater acceptance of their religion as a pretext for invasion. It was also feared that the crop failures of 1865 could become a basis for greater adoption of the religion. Roughly 10,000 Koreans would be executed from this crackdown, and all but 3 French missionaries would be as well. In June of '66, a Frenchman by the name of Felix Radal managed to escape and fled to Yanti in northeastern China. Here, the French Far Eastern commander, a Rear Admiral Pierre-Gustave Roset, got word of the massacre and became determined to launch a punitive expedition against the Koreans. He would get the backing of the French consuls within the Far East without consent from the mainland, but he would be limited to the men that he had on hand. Due to the lack of information about Korea, even including navigation charts, Roset conducted a multitude of surveying expeditions, focused primarily around the Korean capital of Seoul. From these, he concluded that a direct attack against the fortified capital was unwise, largely due to his limited force of 1,000 men and large-hulled ships that couldn't easily navigate the shallow Han River. Instead, he opted to occupy Gaina Island, which commanded the entrance to the Han River. Taking the island would block the waterway to the capital during the harvest season and hopefully would be enough to enforce his demands on the Koreans. Roset would arrive off the coast on October the 14th, landing 140 men at the coastal town of Dokonsonri, and began a march overland towards Kawandol in the center of the island. By the 16th, the city would fall with limited fighting, with the Korean militia and civilians fleeing to the mainland. For the next week, the French forces would be reinforced to 400 men with even more fusiliers. They engaged in nearly a dozen skirmishes surrounding Galandeux, taking lightly defended villages and forts along the main roadways to the east and south. Within Galandeux itself, they would find a large quantity of silver and munitions, as well as nearly 300 volumes of the Royal Yue books, a very lengthy series of written records about the Yonsun dynasty over the centuries. These, as well as some other artifacts, would be transported back to mainland France, with the books only returning to Korea in 2011 on a renewable lease. On October the 26th, a reconnaissance party of 160 would land on the mainland, to the south of the Mont-Tension fortress, the main fortification that lay along the roadway towards Seoul. Here, the Koreans laid an ambush for the French, firing upon them as they neared a forward gate, inflicting 3 dozen casualties before being driven back into the fortress proper. Cannon were drawn up to bombard the fortress, but Korean reinforcements were fast approaching from the southeast, and the French retreated off the mainland. At the same time, rumors had spread of a large Korean army quickly advancing through southern Ganhwa towards the occupied territories. To confirm the reports, 120 men moved towards Cheondeonsa, but once again had entered right into an ambush. The area seemed abandoned, but Korean musket fire inflicted heavy damage to the French column, forcing them to retreat. With a fast-approaching army that far outnumbered his own, Rosé called off the expedition and would leave the island by November the 12th. While he attempted to claim a great victory for his minimal gains, it wasn't enough to appease the European residents in China, and they called for a full-on invasion the following spring. Rosé did draw up for a future invasion, but word reached him that his men and ships were to forestall any future conflict and return to the French mainland, in part due to the French losses from their intervention in Mexico. This campaign, while ultimately minor and with relatively limited bloodshed, would prolong the Korean isolationism for some time. But as we always know from history, you can only hide for so long before one way or another you are forced to change course. North Africa had long been a power struggle between the Europeans and native states, or Ottoman vassals. The Spanish and Portuguese had long held a number of cities within North Africa, largely for future colonization that the discovery of the New World put on hold. But many wars and battles would be fought over these cities. In today's episode, we'll be covering one of those conflicts, the 1732 Spanish invasion of Iran. During the multi-year-long War of Spanish Succession, the Spanish cities of Oran and Mes el-Kebé, which had been longtime Spanish strongholds in North Africa, were finally retaken by the Beylict of Mascara in 1708, ending over 2 centuries of European control in the region. With the War of the Succession ended, and with the resurgence of a new Spain, King Philip V organized an expedition to recoup the lost cities, and he was paid largely via threatening the Republic of Genoa in 1726, forcing them to either pay 2 million pesos or have the city be bombed into oblivion. The Spanish fleet would start to be assembled in the city of Alicante at the start of 1732, headed by the Duke of Montemar, José Carrillo de Albornoz. The preparation of the expedition nearly caused the ruin of Alicante, as the town was largely supplied from the port, and most of what came in was automatically given to the expedition. But after months of planning, gathering the men, supplies, and ships, the invasion fleet would finally set sail, with its eyes on the city of Iran. Making up this grand fleet would be 12 ships of the line, each of them packing 60 or 74 guns, 50 frigates packing 32 or 46 guns, 26 galleys with 6 guns each, 96 Xebec vessels acting as both troop and supply vessels, 109 troop transport vessels, plus hundreds more craft that included a combination of brigs, galleys, bomb vessels, motorboats, and others. The army itself was split into 32 infantry battalions, 12 Royal Guard regiments, and a company of Iranian riflemen, amounting to 23,000 men. Aiding them would be 3,400 cavalrymen split into 8 regiments, as well as an artillery battalion which boasted 60 guns and 20 mortars. Mustafa Bouchelem, the Dey of Algiers, had received advance warning of the Spanish invasion and gathered his forces for their eventual arrival. With him would be his militia forces amounting to roughly 9,000 men, 1,500 of them being mounted tribal warriors. Most of the men were poorly, if trained at all, and most were poorly equipped, many having firearms dating back decades if not hundreds of years, or they were armed with swords and bows as their only offensive capability. At the center of the army, and acting as its heart and core, however, were 150 Ottoman janissaries with relatively modern equipment, and they included a small contingent of modern artillery, which numbered 10 pieces. Supporting the Dey would be Allied troops numbering 1,500 Turkish regulars and 5,000 horsemen from the Kingdom of Fez. The Ottomans themselves would send 2,000 janissaries from Constantinople to aid as well, but neither force was present during the invasion. The Dey would be left with his outnumbered and out-equipped forces to fend off the Spanish. On June the 27th, the Spanish would arrive off the coast, landing just the east of Mes el Kebe. The landing was not heavily opposed, and only skirmishers, consisting of light Algerian cavalry, would engage the Spanish, slowing them down on their advance towards the city. At a location between the two cities, the Spanish would set about building a small fort from where to launch their invasion from. The Algerians would attack multiple times at the encampment, but would be repulsed time and time again. With his force split between 3 locations, the Dey knew that he could not have the ability to stop the Spanish. And instead, he decided that the best course of action was to consolidate his forces, harass the invading troops as best as he could, and await reinforcements. The Spanish would reach the gates of Mes el Kebe on July the 1st, and defending the city would be the 150 janissaries that the Dey had at his command, the rest of the men having been transferred out from the city and taken up positions with the rest of the army in the mountain pass. The Spanish would put the city under siege, but the janissaries surrendered on the same day, on the condition that they would be allowed to leave Algeria and return home. Albornoz, hearing that the Dey's troops were on the move, quickly advanced with 7,000 men towards the nearby mountains, where he knew the bulk of the Algerian army was. Caught off guard by the sudden advance, the Algerian army scattered, some regrouping in Oran itself, while many others simply laid down their arms and returned home. His forces now scattered and weakened even more, the Dey pulled all of his troops out of Oran, knowing that defending it was not possible, and the Spanish would occupy the city on July the 5th. This would not be the last of the Dey's attempts, however. In August, after Montemir had left North Africa, he would leave behind a garrison of 8,000 troops in the cities. The Dey, now reinforced with Afensian troops and Ottoman reinforcements, would attempt to take Oran again. With 10,000 men, he would advance on the city, but ultimately would fail, losing 2,000 men to the Spanish's 500. While he would continue to probe the city for the rest of the year, he never had the manpower to dislodge the garrison troops, and he'd ultimately admit defeat and send the rest of his men back home, leaving Spain once again with the Algerian footholds. Yet, Spain would not forget of this war, and years later, they would once again come back in force to try and pacify Algeria, leading to one of the largest disasters ever to face the Spanish army. But that is a topic for another time.
The Japanese state went from a largely technological backwater to a major world powerhouse in less than 80 years. This was achieved via a massive and rapid modernization process, and a gradual expansion of Japanese influence over Eastern Asia, whether that be economically or militarily. During this process of modernization, the state would flex its new muscles in various localized affairs, which, while may not have shown to have much effect on the surface, would play a critical part in future history. And for the first time in over 250 years, Japanese soldiers would fight on foreign soil. The Japanese invasion of Taiwan has begun. The invasion's pretext was based on the 1871 Mudan incident, where 54 Ryukyu sailors were massacred by the Peiwan, one of the indigenous cultures of Taiwan. While Ryukyu had technically been an independent kingdom for centuries, it had long been a tributary and vassal state of the Ming and later Jin Empire. However, Japanese influence had already shifted the status of this island to change, and they would fall under de facto control of Japan in 1872, in return for cancellation of the debt, and kinda just because Japan said so. So, for a few years in the 1870s, Ryukyu was a recognized vassal state of both countries. As a vassal state, the Ryukyuan population was under Japanese protection, and upon hearing news of the massacre, Japan would send Foreign Minister Soichi Tainomi to Beijing in June of 1873, asking for a compensation to the families and a persecution of the perpetrators of the killings. At first, the Chinese government denied the request, stating that it was a purely internal affair since, once again, the Ryukyuan kingdom was still de jure a Chinese state. Tainomi countered by stating that 4 of the slain were from the Oyo province of Japan. That is actually incorrect. It is not the Oyo province. There is no such thing as the Oyo province in Japan. I think one of my sources were saying it, or I was just pulling a dumb and didn't notice until I was nearly done. The area in question was the Orie Prefecture, or the present-day Yahama Prefecture. Wanted to clarify that, just so I didn't get yelled at in the comments. Anyway, let's continue. In which the reply was that the aboriginal cultures of Taiwan were not under direct Jin authority, and so negotiations came to a standstill. After a few weeks, Tainomi finally returned home, conversing with his government on the next best course of action to take. Charles Legendre, an American military advisor to the Japanese, put pressure on the Japanese government to take the matters into their own hands, using force to deliver a message against the Jin government. Legendre, in his memos, had viewed Japan as a major player within the Far Eastern region. In order to protect itself from this threat, he thought, Japan should use the failure of the Chinese government to meet their demands, as a pretext for annexing Taiwan and the Pescadores island chain. Legendre justified this argument based on an assessment of international conditions at the time, as the conflict between Britain and Russia over the Eastern Question grew worse, and the danger of war between the two would increase. Japan may very well soon be locked out of the ability to gain a foothold on the international stage, and would end up merely as a colony between other powers in the region. He predicted that the European powers would not interfere in such an attempted annexation, as Britain and Russia would prefer to see a Japan rather than a rival power occupy Taiwan. An expedition was planned and put into motion. By using the pretext of the Mudan incident, Japan would expand their influence over not only the Ryukyu island chain, but also attempt to capture the island of Taiwan itself. They would bring with them 300 women and children to start constructing lodgings and settlements on the island, expanding their colonial control as time went on. The timing was relatively good too, as the Jin were still recovering or engaged in a multitude of wars and rebellions on the mainland, all of which had massively crippled the economy and military power of the state. With this knowledge, the Japanese government and military planners believed that a quick localized conflict away from the mainland wouldn't alert officials in the Jin government enough to mount a major expedition to protect Taiwan. In case that this thought was wrong, however, Japan had managed to get nominal backing from the European and American consuls. stating that Japan had the blessing of their mother countries to do so as they pleased in Taiwan. As news reached higher up in the foreign consul chain, however, the official stance had changed. Considering that Japan had not managed to get permission from the government in Beijing for their actions, these governments now put pressure on Japan to flat out not engage in the expedition, or heavily limit it in scope. The fear of a large-scale war occurring over the Far East was of great concern to the British in particular, who had vested commercial interests in the area and did not wish for a prolonged war to endanger them. British Minister in Japan, Sir Harry Parkes, had managed to obtain Russian and Spanish neutrality during any Japanese actions in Taiwan. However, the inclusion of American personnel and vessels threatened to cause this conflict to expand exponentially. Regardless, the first ships of the expedition sailed in mid-April from Shinawa, a port a short distance from Edo or present-day Tokyo. A force had been assembled for the invasion, which amounted to 3,700 men, headed by Saigō Sugemichi. These men were growing restless and gradually grew to ignore the demands of even the central Japanese government. The first troop-laying ships would sail on May the 3rd, a day before Secretary of the Cabinet Kane Yugosayu arrived in the city on orders for the expedition to be cancelled. As vessels had already left though, it got approved post-fact, but the aims were gradually restricted, and as the Chinese reaction stiffened, the government would use the claim that Saigō had acted as a marauder without Tokyo's approval, all in an effort to save geopolitical face and standing. On May the 6th, Saigō's troops would land a small force, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Douglas Castle, an American who had been part of the 1867 American expedition to Formosa, and as recently as 1872 had deeply explored the main areas of projected conflict. For this, him and Lieutenant James R. Wason were made colonels of the Japanese Expedition Army, and this army would make a landing at Anschluss, a small town on the southern tip of the island. The local tribe near Anschluss were friendly to the Japanese, and many were recruited to help build trenches and cottages for the incoming troops, and the small contingent of families that accompanied them. 2 of them would be taken as interpreters, and within just a few days, all the tribes on the island were allied against or neutral in the conflict against the Peiwa and their Ryukyu allies. Vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Peiwa engaged purely in guerrilla-style tactics, deceptions, ambushes, and outmaneuvering the Japanese to cause what damage that they could. But even they understood that unless the Jin interacted directly on their behalf, victory would be virtually impossible, and they were merely delaying the inevitable. On May the 10th, Admiral Akamasu and General Tani arrived at the town with another 500 men and supplies to fortify their landing. With this increase in forces, the army would start to push forward, and on the 17th would be the first main action of the conflict. A 100-strong reconnaissance mission to the east of Anschluss would be ambushed by Peiwan soldiers, resulting in the death of 2 Japanese. Further action occurred along the southern coast, where men under Admiral Akamasayu Yorishiri came under fire while surveying the local area, but resulted in minimal casualties. Another 1,500 soldiers would be landed on May the 20th, and with the increased presence, Japanese Colonel Sakamasa Mada, who was already known for his part in the Saga Rebellion, would march inland with over 150 men and engage in the Battle of Stone Gate, the only set-piece battle of the whole campaign. The Paiwanese and their allies would number some 70 men, and they had already established ambush locations previous to the engagement. The Japanese, in turn, were left to try and find cover behind scatterings of rocks, and they were fighting in waist-high water. The fighting between the 2 forces would continue on for over an hour, with the native forces eventually retreating after being outflanked. The Battle of Stone Gate would leave the Peiwan injured heavily, as they had to leave behind 16 dead and dozens severely wounded, which included their local chief and his son. And after this battle, local resistance to the Japanese invasion would be extremely limited, and only an outbreak of malaria within the Japanese camp prevented further advances from their hold on the southern tip of Taiwan. Internationally, tensions between the Qing government and Japan were rapidly growing, and by August of 1874, negotiations between the two were going nowhere, and both were planning for an all-out war. The Qing had mustered over 10,000 men in the South Canton province for an eventual trip over to Taiwan. Taxes in the province were being levied heavily, and fortifications were being built up in Shanghai and Tianjin in case the Japanese attacked. In the same time, the Japanese were also preparing for war. They had purchased 3 new steamers, and the garrison in Taiwan had grown up to 6,000 men, with many more planned, and neither side were willing to back down. Yet, even as continued plans for war were drawn up, an eventual compromise was met. After months of meeting, on October the 31st of 1874, the Beijing Agreement to end this conflict was finally signed, and in the agreement, Japanese actions to quote-unquote protect its subjects was deemed legitimate, and consolidation money to the tune of 500,000 taels were paid to Tokyo, both for the deaths of the Raccoon families, but also for the infrastructure improvements that Japan made in Taiwan, and Beijing promised to enforceably put the native cultures of Taiwan back under their control. By December of the same year, Japanese forces would leave Taiwan as Chinese rule de facto returned.
The German invasion of France during World War II was seen very much like a swift, unexpected strike against Germany's main continental opponent. However, this strike didn't occur until over 9 months into the war, a time where limited action occurred on this front, and many assumed that the war would be over before major fighting occurred. This time period was given a name, and is a vital piece of World War II history that tends to be forgotten, but not today. In this video, we'll be looking at the so-called Phony War. Before talking about the war itself, we need a little bit of background information to get us up to speed. During the late 1930s, Germany started to remilitarize, in preparation for war against the European powers once again. A string of notable events occurred, such as the 1936 reoccupation of the Rhineland, the 38 annexation of Austria, and the 39 annexation of Czechoslovakia. These events pitted the Western powers in Germany closer and closer to war, as the policy of appeasement that the Western powers held was being eroded away. After the annexation of Czechoslovakia, Germany demanded the Danzig Quarter from Poland, a stretch of land that housed the port of Danzig and separated mainland Germany from the East Prussian region. Poland asserted that it would fight against Germany, viewing and hoping that the Treaty of Alliance between their nation and France would be honored. The Western powers saw that the only way to be able to win against Germany should fighting erupt was for a two-front war to be opened up, with a viable, strong power to the east, much like in World War I. The Little Entente, which was a loose alliance between Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania, was meant to act as the strong power, but it fell apart due to a variety of factors by the mid-30s. So Poland, who the French already had established an alliance with, was left as the only viable option, as the Soviet Union had yet to ally itself with the Western powers. German demands and pressure against Poland increased throughout 1939, more so after the Germans sent an ultimatum to Lithuania, demanding them to return the Memel region to East Prussia, a region that was lost following World War I. The Western powers now largely forwent the path of appeasement, even though British Premier Neville Chamberlain still viewed appeasement as the main path forward. France and Britain stood steadfast in their support for Poland, all while trying to coerce the Soviet Union to join in an alliance against Germany. Instead of an alliance against them, however, the Soviets and Germans signed a non-aggression pact on August the 23rd of 1935, dubbed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The pact edged out spheres of influence in Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union, and acted as a guarantee that Germany would not be thrown into a two-front war situation that so harmed the nation 25 years previous. On September the 1st of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and in a response, France and Britain declared war against Germany, thus starting World War II.
and it was expected that a major French offensive from the west would force the Germans to send their army away from Poland to meet this threat. However, the French action proved to be extremely lackluster. On September the 7th, the French launched the Saar offensive with roughly 40 divisions. This included 400 tanks and 4,700 artillery pieces. Facing them was 23 understrength divisions of the German army, who only had around 100 artillery pieces at their disposal. The French mobilization that started on August the 26th was met with horrible delays, largely suffering from the ineffective mobilization structure that the French had yet to correct from World War I. The French invasion in Germany started on September the 7th along the 20-mile line from the southern Luxembourgian border. The 11 French divisions advanced roughly 5 miles into German territory to minimal resistance, capturing a dozen or so towns and villages along the way. Small gains were made on the 12th, and following the complete occupation of the Verdant Forest, all French advances halt, just a short distance from the German Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was a defensive network similar to the French Maginot Line or the Finnish Mannerheim Line. This line was meant to act as a network to prevent French advance. With the fall of Poland on the 21st of September, the French troops were ordered back to the Maginot Line, as the bulk of German troops would now be coming to the west. Many of the generals on the field protested this move, as they saw the loss of life as utterly wasted and a quick defeat possible if they were just allowed to go forward. French covering forces held the territory until late October, when the German army, reinforced by the men from the Polish campaign, pushed them out with light casualties. In the end, the Saar offensive cost the Germans some 600 men, while the French suffered over 2,200. The next major action didn't occur in the west, but instead in the frozen north. Russia, the almighty bear, lashed out against one of its former territories. The Russian Revolution at the tail end of World War I saw many nations fracture and separate from the empire. While many of these were reabsorbed, the Balkan nations, Poland, and Finland retained their independence. This the Soviets aimed to correct. Eastern Poland was occupied in late September, the Balkan nations in October and November, and all that remained was the lightly populated Finland. On paper, it would have been an extremely easy task for the Soviets, as the Finns were outmanned over 10-1, out-equipped, out-supplied, and outside of the Scandinavian nations had no hope for allies. With this, they were confident in waging what would be titled the Winter War. The result was a very, very Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, and their goal of annexation of the Finnish nation went up in a blaze of gunfire and national embarrassment. But this war had worried the Western Allies, and in early 1940, they pledged upwards of 50,000 men to assist the Finnish army against the Soviets. This offer wasn't so much in an attempt to help the Finnish, but to use the ongoing conflict as a way to block a critical component of the German war machine, Swedish iron ore. The Germans for the whole war were largely dependent on the high-grade iron ore, and the Norwegian port of Narvik was the only location for many months of the year that the ore was shipped from. If the Allies could take control of Narvik and the iron ore mines in Sweden before the Germans could mount an effective defense, it heavily crippled war-making production. By late February of 1940, the question wouldn't be if Scandinavian neutrality would be broken, but instead, when. On April the 9th, Germany launched Operation Weserboom, invading Denmark and Norway. The Allies managed to land in Norway by the 14th, but by then, the whole southern section of the nation was under occupation, and fighting over Narvik would continue until June, as on May the 10th, Germany launched their full-out attack on France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, officially ending the phony war and ending the possibility of a quick war.